The room was silent, interrupted only by the faint whisper of the night wind outside the moonlit window. Through the half-open curtains, it cast a light that softly illuminated the young man, whose gaze was fixed on the young woman. The maid Irene looked at the boy and understood that servants must never show emotions. Her heart beat in unison with his slow breath, as if they had become one that night. His gaze slid over her face, absorbing every feature, as if trying to remember them forever. He leaned over the young woman's face and told her that if she was against everything that was happening, then she must say everything now, but the servants were the property of the Imperial family, and they must always remember this. It all happened several years ago in the Veronica Imperial Palace, where Irene worked as a maid. She was the head maid, so she was responsible for a large number of tasks and supervised the work of other maids. The experience of living with a group of brothers and sisters turned out to be useful for the servants. Irene's father died in the war, and her mother fell seriously ill. She had to feed the whole family because it was hard to survive on a small village salary. Therefore, she seized the opportunity to become a maid in the Imperial Palace with all her might. 2 months of work had already passed, and the girl was satisfied with her salary. And her life in the capital, she served the princess with pleasure, because the work was not hellishly hard. Lauren Veronica was the princess of the empire, and constantly praised Irene for the fact that the maid quickly took care of all the tasks. Irene was simply a savior to her highness, and was always there to help. Lauren said that her brother, whom the maid had never seen before, would return today. Her brother was the second prince of the Veronica Empire, captain of the Order of Knights. But despite his high status, there were many rumors in high society about his rude character. And harsh, Irene accompanied the princess to the banquet, but suddenly she said that the shoes were too small, and that her feet hurt. During the preparations, the maids mistakenly brought shoes one size too small. But the banquet started in 5 minutes, and there was no time to choose other shoes, and Irene had to save the situation. The lady's legs hurt a lot. After a few steps, she couldn't walk, and the maid tried to figure out how to fix everything. The maid looked at her black shoes, which were only worn by imperial servants and had a special history. Her mother cared a lot for her daughter, but the family was poor and she really wanted to do something good for the girl. She couldn't help the young woman get into Mark's academy, which the girl dreamed of, but she decided to do at least something, and gave her these wonderful and expensive shoes made of genuine leather. Irene didn't want to ruin her mother's gift, so she only wore the shoes on special occasions. She offered the princess to wear her shoes instead of hers, since the girls were the same size. She gave Lauren her shoes and ordered Lisa to accompany the princess, while she went in search of something suitable for her. The banquet was a success. Irene took the first free minute, sat on a bench, and was happy. The black shoes were not visible under the hem of the dress, and troubles were avoided. But because she had been running barefoot for a long time, her feet had received a lot of abuse. Irene didn't want to soil her mother's shoes and continued sitting barefoot on the Imperial Palace courtyard bench. But suddenly, a stranger approached her. His presence made her freeze in place, until the maid couldn't take her eyes off the young man. His eyes were full of mystery, and she felt that something about him attracted her, and the maid involuntarily held her breath, not knowing what to do next. He must be a noble, and Irene shouldn't have looked at him like that, so the girl thought about getting up from the bench and leave the boy alone while lighting a cigarette and saying that it had been a bad day. The girl suddenly smelled forget-me-nots, but it was unlikely that the delicate scent came from him. The stranger looked closely at the modest girl and seemed to want to ask her something. Irene didn't notice immediately, but the boy's appearance turned out to be quite attractive. The young man noticed the girl's bare feet, with the shoes over her knees, but she couldn't say anything to him, because servants must keep their mouths shut always, and everywhere, no matter who is in front of them, because any word she says could harm her highness. He asked the girl if it hurt to walk barefoot, and the maid didn't immediately know how to answer. She remained silent and understood that it would be better for her to leave. But in that case, the young man would look at her strangely seeing her walk barefoot down the street. But she couldn't sit there any longer. The girl was a little embarrassed, so she decided to leave quickly so that the boy would stop looking at her. But he got up from the bench, and she herself, without expecting it, screamed loudly in fear. The young man asked her if she was really scared because he simply got up from the bench, and that's why she screamed out of surprise. Irene really hoped that the stranger would leave now, but it seemed he was in no hurry to go, and sat down opposite the maid. His elegant appearance instantly caught her attention, so she couldn't take her eyes off his handsome face. The young man looked at the maid silently. His eyes reflected a mixture of curiosity and respect. His gaze was full of mystery, as if he saw something more in her than just a maid. He didn't say a word, but his expression spoke for itself. There was something mysterious and attractive about him. Suddenly, he pulled out a handkerchief and asked the girl for permission to wipe her feet, which were dirty from the long work. Irene thought he would just leave and not even talk to servants who had no status. The maid felt her heart start beating faster and couldn't take her eyes off the stranger, who seemed to be scrutinizing her soul. The girl felt strange because no one had ever cared for her before, and now this mysterious guy was cleaning her feet with his silk handkerchief. He asked the girl to make sure to treat the wounds, and for now just wrap the scratches with a handkerchief. The young man said nothing more and left so that the maid would not feel uncomfortable. 3 years passed after this incident. Irene sat in her office and signed important documents. During this time, the girl was promoted to head of the servants in the Imperial palace. One of the maids approached her to tell her that the prince's suit Irene had requested had arrived. The maid was worried and tried to find out from Irene where to take the suit next so as not to do anything wrong. Crown Prince Evan Veronica was supposed to have a meeting before dinner today. He was indignant and was sure that there would be no problems with dinner, but now another meeting had been added to his plate, and the maid tried to calm him down. Everyone simply considered the young man an extremely trustworthy person. She said that the emperor trusted the crown prince, and that was why he entrusted him with such an important job. The more work Evan had, the more work the maid had. A year ago, when she was still working for the princess, everything was much simpler. Although the whole country was moving in one impulse, and the girl was not going to lag behind either. The crown prince was informed that His Highness Theo, the second prince and captain of the Order of Knights, would arrive today. 3 years ago, the Veronica Empire was attacked by barbarians with the support of Emperor Silvarini. The fortress was a border fortification whose soldiers had a hard time. Even the second prince, head of the entire army, had to join the battle. The war lasted 9 months. During this time, even the aristocrats entered the battle. With joint efforts, the empire managed to resist, but news reached the palace that the second prince was seriously wounded. For this reason, he was immediately sent to the temple, which is why he and Evan did not see each other for 2 whole years. The crown prince thanked Irene for her excellent work and said that she had managed everything very quickly. His Majesty the Emperor approached Evan and greeted the young man. The princess saw Irene, who had served her before, and became very happy. She approached her and told her that the girl had lost a lot of weight and that her brother was probably tormenting her, suggesting she return. Lauren shouted, "The crown prince treats her terribly," and said that he will accept Irene at her first request. The guests discussed Theo's return, and not everyone was happy about his imminent visit to the Imperial palace. Irene didn't understand. The prince recovered so quickly, it was a miracle. But why did everyone react so strangely to this news? The emperor reported that Theo had been well 3 months ago, but for some reason had not returned. Suddenly, a man's voice was heard saying that his sister was very angry and allowed people to talk about her brother behind his back. A young man approached and said that the girl was simply not smart enough, so she allowed herself to be rude. The crown prince shook his brother's hand and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and that they probably had something to discuss. The emperor inquired about the boy's health, and he replied that he was completely healthy and that there was no need to worry about his condition. The young man knelt on one knee before His Highness, as befits a true knight, and thanked him for his support. During this entire time, Irene looked at Theo's brother who had arrived and realized that this was the same boy she had known for a long time. The man who had suddenly spoken to her back then, who had wrapped her wounded foot in a handkerchief. He had offered her a helping hand for free that day, and in the war 3 years ago, when nobles and common soldiers had to fight hand in hand, he was probably there too. Then Irene prayed every day for his life, so that they could meet again after many years. But before, the boy's hair was black, but that was all that was different, and even the lavender scent remained the same. She was sure it would remain in her memory for a long time, and she decided to seize the opportunity to get to know him better. Her heart beat faster, but she gathered all her courage and headed towards him with a smile on her face. Irene was skeptical, but she couldn't believe there was anyone else who looked so much alike. She heard from the other maids that His Highness had sent Theo, a doctor who knew magic to heal his serious wounds. And if the doctor had used magic, then everything matched, because magic could change hair color. And witchcraft always left traces, and it was definitely that stranger. After a long dinner, the maid Irene lay in her bed exhausted and realized how tired she was. She remembered the scarves with which the stranger had bandaged her legs and put them under the bed. Irene took out a box containing 2 black men's handkerchiefs from that mysterious and kind stranger. The girl assumed he was a nobleman, but she couldn't imagine that that night she was sitting on the same bench with the second prince of the empire. She just wanted to forget her feelings by remembering that night, because a simple servant is not worthy of feeling anything for His Highness. Although she tried to calm down, her heart continued to ache strangely from strong sensations, and unfamiliar ones. The next morning, Irene hurried to the Crown Prince's office, who had called her by special orders. He said that the girl had arrived just in time and pointed to the sofa where an item was lying. It was a suit for the Empire's longevity ceremony, and it turned out to be too big. Most likely, her measurements were mixed up with Theo's, so he asked Irene to go to his brother and check it. Irene smiled and certainly agreed to carry out the Crown Prince's order and check the suit's measurements. The boy thought that the maid seemed agitated and reacted strangely to his request. The maid knocked on the door of Theo's office and said that she had come on behalf of his older brother, Evan, but there was no one in the room. She saw a suit on the sofa that needed checking and tried to carry out the order silently. The black suit indeed seemed smaller, and it was clear that they had definitely mixed them up. Irene took Theo's shirt and thought he was the first one to take care of her back then, and she swore that her heart would not waver. He had been absent from the palace for 2 whole years, although the wounds were terrible. She still believed that the young man was completely healthy. She brought the shirt closer to her face and inhaled its scent. The shirt also smelled of forget-me-nots, but the girl immediately regained her senses and looked around so that no one would notice how she picked up the shirt. A handsome young man in elegant trousers stood at the door. His gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, and his appearance stood out from the ordinary look. Strange facial features, expressive eyes, and elegant posture gave him mystery and attractiveness. The light passed through the window, emphasizing his silhouette and creating a play of light and shadows on his face. And in an instant, the office was filled with an atmosphere of excitement and anticipation as the maids gaze and the young man met. He said that he had been standing there since the girl took the shirt and put it to her face. And Irene thought with horror that he had just seen everything. From the expression on the young man's face, one would think he was surprised that the maid was standing in his room, smelling his own shirt. Irene couldn't take it anymore and ran out of the office without saying another word about her strange behavior. She ran forward thinking about how crazy she was to let herself be treated like that. The girl was worried about what Theo would think of her now, because he was probably terribly surprised to see this, and she really wanted the boy to quickly forget everything that had just happened. She tried to calm down, but suddenly realized that she had left the suit she came to pick up in Theo's office. And now she had to go back one more time and look into the eyes of the young man, whose shirt she had just sniffed. And it was a real shame. Irene was not a shy girl, so she sorted out her thoughts, accepted reality, and was not going to back down. She knocked on the door of Theo's office and said that Mr. Evan had sent her there to pick up the suit. He said that their costumes were mixed up and that she just wanted to come in quietly and pick up what she needed. Irene quietly approached the sofa where the suit was and carefully picked it up. She apologized for disturbing them and said she would leave the room immediately. But Theo approached her and silently watched as the girl screamed in surprise. He looked at her face, which seemed familiar, and asked if they had met somewhere before. Theo again asked what the girl was doing with his shirt and wanted to hear the truth. Irene didn't know how to explain it. She was smelling the shirt because it smelled good, but in that case the boy would probably think she was weird. Theo asked her to say her name, while Irene looked at him fearfully about to answer. The young man asked why the lady kept being surprised when he had only asked her name. It was her fault. Servants had one purpose above all else, never to disobey their master. Theo wondered if he had asked such a difficult question that the girl remained silent. He assumed she might have wanted to harm his brother, since she was still carrying his shirt. Theo noticed that the girl's uniform had an insignia indicating her high position in the Imperial palace. He leaned toward the silent lady and said that it wouldn't be hard to find her, because there were no more than 10 like her in the palace. Irene hoped the guy didn't know anything else, but he insisted on asking her name. Shortly after this incident, Irene was in the Crown Prince's office. serving him tea when Theo arrived to see his brother. He said he already knew the girl, who was the crown prince's personal maid. His Highness turned to Irene and asked her to leave for a moment to speak with Theo privately. He sat opposite his brother and said he would like to ask him an interesting favor. Suddenly, he asked his brother to give him his personal maid, and he was sure he wouldn't refuse. He didn't understand why he suddenly needed an ordinary servant that he even asked for personally. Theo said that during the first week of knowing each other, he really liked the girl, which is why he wanted to take her as his servant. The crown prince said there were other high-ranking maids, and that it would be difficult to take Irene away from his affairs. She had previously been Lauren's personal maid, but then the young man took her for himself and promoted her to head of the maids. Theo smiled mysteriously and said he wasn't going to steal his brother's good worker. The crown prince agreed to hand over the maid and said that regardless of how Lauren behaved, everyone understood that his brother had not fully recovered. He couldn't believe the wounds had healed and asked again if everything was all right. Theo replied that there was no need to worry about him and that his health had improved after his injuries. The crown prince was worried. Theo was not himself at all, and he might very well be hiding some important information. Once upon a time, there was a priest who promised little Theo that he would only live until he was 23 years old, and his word was irreversible. But everything remained normal. 10 years had passed since then, and the young man, despite all predictions, was still alive. 3 years had passed since Theo turned 23, and exactly 3 years had passed since the war with the Silvarinas began. At that time, the crown prince thought his brother would die in the war, but now he was happy that everything ended well and wanted to ask Irene to go with the prince so she could help him recover. Irene stood by the window and thought about how to make Theo forget about her. And that unfortunate shirt. The young man stopped in the hallway, his gaze drawn to the passing maid. His eyes reflected more than just simple curiosity. Theo observed her with a certain special interest, as if trying to penetrate her world. But in their silent encounter, there was something magical, as if an invisible link, but tangible, had arisen between them. The maid, feeling his gaze upon her, stopped for a moment, and at that moment it seemed as if time stopped, and the world stopped to give them a chance to fully immerse themselves in each other. He told her that he had spoken to his brother about an interesting topic, and that she would soon find out everything herself. Theo remembered their last encounter and asked the maid if she wanted anything else from him. The girl waved her hands frantically and said she didn't want anything else and wouldn't bother the knight. The boy slowly approached the maid, as if drawn to her by a magnet. Every movement of his exuded an invisible energy that filled the air with a mysterious charm. When he finally stood before her, his gaze again turned to her face, as if trying to read secrets and desires in it. It seemed as if the young man was being too persistent and exaggerated, but his face looked as if he had said something trivial. Theo didn't hesitate and openly invited the girl to spend the night with him. Irene covered her ears horrified and started shouting at him not to dare say those words again, and asked the knight to stop. And so it happened. She had just yelled at her master, servant, and lord, and the difference between the high statuses could not be ignored, no matter how much she wanted to. Irene tried to bury these feelings for a long time and wanted to become a faithful servant to Master Evan, but for some reason, he keeps paying attention to the girl and doesn't miss the opportunity to talk to her or see her. Theo continued trying to figure out why the girl was acting strangely and took his shirt that day. He took her hand. Irene was confused and didn't fully understand what to answer, because admitting what she had done was also scary. The maid lowered her head and asked why the young master treated her like that. She couldn't hate the attention of a man she liked, but she was indignant about the words and Theo's behavior. The young man suddenly said that he simply liked the girl, which is why he offered her indecent things. Irene was surprised and asked what the master could possibly like about a common maid. And ordinary. He said she had a pretty face, and Irene was indignant that a person judged another based only on their appearance. Theo didn't want to say that he could fully understand another person, but why not start with appearance? He approached her and asked her to think about his words about spending time together. Irene did not expect such a conversation to happen between them, and she was lost. Theo raised his hands and declared that he had enough for today and would leave the rest to her. Irene didn't understand what he meant, but the young man left without explaining the meaning of his words. The maid and Irene were talking about how His Highness's new servant would be the head of the servants. The girl smiled and realized that from that moment on her life could change drastically. She begged in tears to Master Evan to leave her in the position of his personal maid and not send her with his brother. But according to his experience, she couldn't do anything about it, and the Crown Prince stated that Theo was not particularly demanding. His Highness's servants did not have many duties, but Irene was confused because of one thing. Theo was still bothering her with stupid requests. It turned out that the guy had 2 servants and she had little work left, but there was nothing she could do. And the only thing she could do was try her best. Theo approached her with silent steps and whispered if she had thought about their previous conversation. Irene looked down and said that she hadn't thought about anything regarding his proposal and had no intention of doing so. But Theo kept pressing because he understood everything perfectly. She liked the second prince, and that's why she simply couldn't refuse him. The girl was busy cleaning and thinking about how difficult it was to love such a person. And Theo approached from behind and took her hand. It seemed he was not going to tolerate her refusals and was determined to decisively achieve his goal. With a gentle movement, full of tenderness and decision, Theo hugged the maid, and in that embrace the maid felt a rush of emotions, as if overflowing, flooding her heart with tenderness and love. He tried to kiss her, but Irene pushed the knight with all her might and shouted no. She understood that from the beginning, he was simply making fun of her, and she was very annoyed by feeling that attitude. Irene never thought resisting temptation would be so hard and tried to focus on completing the paperwork. She wasn't completely sure about it, but still, having a person she liked directly offer to spend the night together. Anyone would be surprised. The maid saw a piece of paper with something written in the old Almacked language, which she had seen when she entered school, but which she had stopped using a long time ago. She tried to deal with the pile of papers as quickly as possible and did a good job. Irene wanted to somehow distract attention from herself, because at that rate her heart might stop. A familiar maid, Thelma, whom she hadn't seen since she stopped being the princess's maid, unexpectedly approached her. Her Highness Lorraine sat in a chair and was very happy to see the maid who had been with her for many years. 20 minutes ago, the knight left for a meeting. Considering the time of return, Irene had about 10 minutes to convince Princess Lauren to say the precious words that would make her his personal maid. She asked if the maid was overworked and said that Evan was very busy at the moment, but His Highness didn't know it yet. Irene had now become Theo's personal maid. She said that due to unforeseen circumstances, His Highness had replaced one of the maids with her. Lauren was indignant at the news and wanted to know why her brother did it. Irene replied that she knew nothing about the reasons, but in her mind, she was sure that Theo just wanted to make fun of her. Lauren asked if the knight was causing the girl too much trouble and wanted to help the maid. She couldn't say such a thing, so the maid could only smile gently and hope that Lauren would understand everything by herself, and that's why the girl turned to her for urgent help. Lauren was angry about her brother's behavior and said she intended to go and have an important conversation with him. Irene tried to calm the princess, but she didn't want to listen and was not going to let it go. The maid really didn't want to start a fight between brother and sister, but things turned out differently. Lauren's face was distorted by rage, and her hands were clenched into fists, ready to express all her indignation. She couldn't accept his indifference and selfishness that permeated his every action. And at that moment, the princess did not want to hear excuses or apologies. She just wanted him to understand the full depth of his actions and face the appropriate consequences. Lauren and Irene entered Theo's office, and the angry princess was about to have a serious conversation. Things could have gotten much worse, and the maid was worried if she had known things would turn out this way. She would never have brought up the topic. Theo said that the maid would have been better off on his side than on the princess's. Lauren was indignant and asked why Theo made Irene his personal maid. The princess scolded. The young master was making the girl's life difficult and behaving strangely. Theo looked at his sister with disdain and pretended not to have the slightest idea what they were talking about. Lauren stated that the maid even had to turn to her for help to no longer tolerate the master and his antics. The two looked at Irene, who was trembling with fear and only dreamed of turning back time. He asked her if she was causing any trouble for the maid, and the girl denied it. But she knew that today she had made a big mistake that couldn't be corrected. But this way at least, she would stop creating even more problems. The servant had no choice, and the maid felt uncomfortable with the whole situation. She picked up the tray with the tea set and heard Theo softly say her name. He asked her again if her stay with him was a problem, and this time he expected to hear a sincere answer. Theo got up and said he didn't expect the girl to be so upset, and that she even went to Lauren for help. He promised he wouldn't allow them to treat her like that again, and asked her not to worry. The young man apologized for everything he had done before, and Irene felt strange after all. Servants who lost trust had no future, and it was an obvious truth that there should always be trust and respect in the relationship between master and servant. But it turned out that Irene had deliberately slandered him in front of someone else, and it would have been better if Theo hadn't paid attention to her from the beginning of their acquaintance. Before, he was always the first to greet the maid, but now he always passes by silently. Theo started behaving completely differently, as if Irene no longer existed in the palace. It was a real torture for the maid, but obviously it was her fault. If she hadn't told Miss Lauren everything, nothing would have happened. One of the maids said that they needed His Highness's measurements to sew a suit for Lady Lohan's birthday celebration. The measurements for the previous suit turned out to be too small. This week there was supposed to be a celebration, and next week there was a longevity festival, so the girl needed to get the correct measurements. Irene took a tape measure and headed straight to Theo's office to take his measurements. He was in his office, busy compiling important official documentation. She asked permission to enter and approach the table where Theo was sitting looking at her. The maid notified, they told her, that the suit for the longevity festival didn't fit the young man, and that he needed to take new measurements. Theo quietly got up from the table and walked towards the girl who was waiting with a tape measure. The maid carefully raised her eyes and looked at the boy standing in front of her. His gaze was a mixture of curiosity, interest, and slight hesitation, and she looked at him as if trying to penetrate his thoughts and understand his mood. The maid carefully took the gentleman's measurements, trying to be precise and attentive in every measurement, her hands easily sliding over the shirt, carefully recording every parameter. Her gaze was focused, and her face expressed seriousness and responsibility for completing this task. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Their gazes merged in a single moment, as if creating an invisible connection between them during that brief moment. She sensed something special in his eyes, perhaps an expression of pleasant surprise or tenderness, and her heart began to beat a little faster, and her face, despite her restraint, began to glow with a slight blush. Irene took the gentleman's measurements and couldn't stop thinking that they were too close. But soon that moment passed, and she returned to her duties. But that brief mutual understanding remained in her heart, reminding her of an unusual eye encounter. He said he would order a custom-made suit and tried to calm his heart, that ant with force out of her chest from excitement. The maid grabbed the piece of paper with the measurements and tried to leave, but Theo suddenly placed his hands on her shoulders and asked her to be careful. There was not only interest in his eyes, but also a certain mystery that made the maid feel a little confused. She tried to support his gaze while remaining calm, but inside her heart beat much faster under the influence of his attention. A young man entered the office and said he came with a report on the northern region. He looked at the maid and seemed to notice the worried expression on her face. Irene tried to leave the office as quickly as possible because she could no longer contain the emotions overwhelming her. Theo noticed that the boy was staring intently at Irene and asked why he was looking at her like that. He asked if this was the same maid whom Theo had recently talked about during their meeting. It seemed to him that Theo had been interested in women for a long time and asked him directly about it. The young man asked, then with the maid's face, she seemed somehow tense and worried. Irene tried to contain her feelings, but it was clear from her face that the girl was clearly not telling the whole story. The young man began his report by saying that Marquis Isaac was actively helping the development of the northern lands. He gathered a pile of papers and reported that Theo's presence was not necessary, and that if anything was needed, he would let them know. From the pile of papers, a black envelope accidentally flew out. It was a letter that Theo had not yet replied to. It seemed that someone wanted to attract Theo to their side in any possible way to take advantage of his popularity among high society. He took the letter out of the envelope and tried to read it. Anyway, they were supposed to meet at the temple service, and Theo couldn't understand why he had to write so many letters in that case. The letter was written in another language, and the young man was indignant that the letter was sent to the palace without even being translated into an understandable language. The young man suggested bringing someone from the theological school, but Theo said there was no point in continuing to try, and that, in any case, the letter was full of nonsense. Preparations for Lady Lohan's birthday celebration were in full swing, and all the servants were very busy now. One of the maids told Irene that she now understands why everyone wants to take her with them, and sees how the girl manages many tasks. The young man's suit was ready, and Irene began to worry about a single reminder Theo. She tried not to think about nonsense and did her best to focus on the event preparations. Fortunately, this time they were not left alone with the boy, while the clerk continued reading the report to him. Irene prepared Theo for departure, but the young man continued to behave strangely and avoiding eye contact. Once attended, Theo and Irene went out into the formal hall while the assistant asked the knight to behave decently at the event. Assistant Basil was His Highness's closest subordinate, so Mr. Theo could trust him. The young man was about to quickly greet everyone and leave, but then he asked where Lauren was, and the maid replied that the princess should be near the entrance to the Imperial Palace. It seemed that the other guests were also there, and Basil apologized, as he hadn't been to the palace for a long time, and was a little confused. Irene gave directions, and at that moment, Theo turned and looked her in the eyes after a long time of ignoring her. They were greeted by the Crown Prince, who informed them that Mr. Theo, as always, would be late for events. Princess Lauren cheerfully greeted the maid Irene and wanted to know how she was. Irene congratulated Her Highness on her birthday, and the princess shared that she was very happy that the maiden came to the celebration. Lauren saw Theo and angrily declared that she didn't expect to see such an insolent young man there. The emperor intervened and said there was no time for arguments and that it was time to begin the solemn celebration. Lauren smiled and greeted all the guests, while Theo frowned and thought how sick he was of looking at his proud sister. Irene walked nearby and was glad that everything was going even better than she expected so far, considering the last encounter between brother and sister. However, she hoped everything would continue like this, but suddenly Miss Lauren asked Theo a favor. In honor of the holiday, the brave girl invited her brother for a drink and keep her company. No one understood what was happening, but it was clear that something was brewing between the relatives. The servants immediately brought a table, at which Lauren and Theo sat down to try to prove something to each other again. Lauren immediately said that it probably wouldn't be interesting just to drink it, and that it was necessary to add something special to it. The princess said that the young man must perfectly understand what she wants in return, and she presented her conditions. Theo would hand over the maiden Irene if he lost the drinking game now. The guy firmly held the glass in his hands and was not going to follow the example of his stupid sister. He asked if the princess really loved the maid so much that she was willing to do such a thing. Irene felt strange. She didn't understand why they were making a bet, and no matter who chose her, she still had no say in the matter. Theo drank the first glass and said it was time to start and offered Lauren his glass and set the conditions if he wins. The princess must promise never to bring up that topic again. Lauren agreed and asked the young man to make sure to keep his word. With every hour that passed, there were more and more empty wine bottles, but the brother and the sister still had no intention of ending the duel. Irene was tired of watching the circus and intended to try to stop them. Lauren and Theo continued to lift glass after glass, and after every bottle they drank. They asked for more. The maid approached them and told them that the brother and sister had already drunk too much, and asked them to stop. Theo pretended not to hear anything. He opened a new bottle and poured himself a full glass of wine. He turned to the maid and shouted that he was not going to hand her over to Princess Lauren. The effects of excessive alcohol were not long in coming, and soon the princess felt very unwell. It seemed that Theo was also in a bad mood and didn't understand at all what was happening around him. Irene saw that the knight was completely unable to stand and asked for permission to help him get to the room. The maids helped her lead the boy to the sofa while he was still recovering from so many bottles of wine. The maid thought that Theo clearly wasn't feeling well and wanted to help the master somehow. She simply wanted to alleviate his suffering, because that was the direct responsibility of a servant. But suddenly, her gaze stopped at the sleeping young man for whom she had feelings. She stroked his cheek with her hand and felt her heart beating fast with just a light touch. Apparently, she was in love with the young man, but she was sure that he hated her after that incident. Irene continued to stroke his face and didn't understand why he kept avoiding communicating with her. She felt hurt by the knight's behavior, who kept sowing chaos around him, and if he had said he hated her, it would have been much easier and simpler for the girl. The maid couldn't restrain herself and touched her beloved's lips and sweetly kissed him. And at that moment time seemed to stop, their hearts beat in unison, and the world around them disappeared, leaving only a moment of their mutual tenderness. Teo opened his eyes at that very moment and saw Irene in front of him, who had just kissed him on the lips. Her face turned red, and her heart beat faster out of shame towards the knight for whom she felt admiration and respect. Suddenly, Teo got up from the sofa, and in an instant, Irene found herself on the sofa instead of the young man. He looked the girl in the eyes and asked what she had just done while he lay there with his eyes closed. The maid suddenly got scared, her heart started beating wildly, and her skin covered in small drops of sweat. Thea reminded the maid that she had recently refused to spend the night with him, but now she was behaving differently. He tried to find out why she kept doing this, but she opposed all his signs of attention. Irene started crying and said that she had never said no, she just couldn't behave like that. Theo asked the girl to look him in the eyes and no longer be afraid to avoid his gaze. He wanted to avoid further misunderstandings between them and asked again if Irene wanted to spend the night with him. Theo whispered that if the girl didn't answer his question immediately, he would simply kiss her. Their lips met in a tender kiss, full of warmth and tenderness. For a moment, they forgot everything around them, immersed in that moment of passion and mutual desire. At that moment, Irene realized that it seemed impossible, but she really loved him. The girl, feeling excitement and tenderness for her beloved, kissed her beloved man for the first time. And sparks of excitement and love burned in her eyes, and her heart beat faster in anticipation of intimacy. It was a strange feeling, and the girl had never felt anything like it for anyone. Irene admitted that she always wanted to be close to Theo, but she couldn't say it directly. The knight said that after this meeting, things could become much more serious between them. The maid woke up early in the morning in Theo's bed and realized with horror that she had slept completely naked. A young man slept next to her, and the girl realized that she had gone completely crazy to do that. She didn't understand how she could have thought of doing that to her master, and she was very afraid that her absence would be noticed in the bedroom. And strange rumors could start arising about their relationship, but Theo suddenly hugged the girl and supported her against him. Theo saw the scared maid and said that he was aware of everything last night and was not under the influence of alcohol, so he was ready to take responsibility for what happened between them. He said he would order a maid's uniform, and Irene feared that everyone could quickly guess their relationship. Theo sat down next to her on the bed and kindly offered to bring her breakfast, because the girl was probably hungry. The boy, feeling a storm of emotions within himself and overflowing with desire for the girl, slowly approached her and gently pressed his lips against hers. His kiss was full of passion and tenderness, as if at that moment they became the center of the universe, and the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them. After a while, Basil brought breakfast and a maid's uniform, and Irene was able to get dressed. Breakfast was in front of the maid, but she felt completely uncomfortable eating in that setting, especially because there was another person in the office. It seems Teo was not going to have breakfast and asked his assistant to inform him of the news, and he informed him that a letter had arrived from the temple. Irene saw the strange language on the letter and realized she had seen something similar before, but that time she had thrown it in the trash. Judging by the conversation between the young people, it could be assumed that Theo had been ignoring the incoming letters this whole time. But Irene understood that only some very important information could be sent with such insistence. She decided to help the young men and asked His Highness to allow her to give them some advice. It turned out that the lady knew and understood the ancient language, so she said she could translate the letter for Theo. 10 years ago, a church priest spoke words about an absolutely true prophecy that surely had to come true. He predicted that in exactly 10 years, His Highness Theo would meet death, and this could not be changed in any way. The young men looked at the maid and were very surprised to hear words of help from a simple girl. Irene took the piece of paper with the ancient text and carefully studied the signs that were written. Irene once tried to enter the theological academy and studied the ancient language before enrolling. The maid who failed to enter the academy said that circumstances developed in such a way that she couldn't enroll there for some reason. The girl really spoke the ancient language and could easily read everything written in the letter. Theo and Basil looked at the girl with admiration and considered her knowledge truly amazing. The young man said that although he was from the royal family of Veronica, religion was not something close to him at all. But until now, absolutely All the high priest's prophecies had come true. And 10 years ago, he was given a strange prophecy to die at exactly 23 years old. He was still alive, but he could never forget the suffering his family endured when they found out. Judging by the translation of the letter, it seemed that Theo's fate had somehow changed during this time. But it was very suspicious. Basil insisted on visiting the temple, but Theo had enough problems without this prophecy, so he ordered them to be there 4 days after the dedication ceremony. Irene was happy to be able to translate the letter and at least help the young master somehow. The maid arrived at the servants' room, and one of them asked why Irene didn't return to the dormitory yesterday. She said that Mr. Theo had been a little drunk yesterday. The girl warned that it would be better if the butler didn't find out what happened, and asked Irene to cover the kiss mark on her neck. So as not to lose her job, the maid now had to be more careful with His Highness. But it seemed he thought the opposite. He hugged her and asked where her attire was for the next ceremony, but the maid replied that she would go in her uniform. Theo suggested that the girl take a break and ask the butler to take her place. And he was happy that she wanted to help, but there was nothing important or special about the ceremony. The young man said that if the girl intended to work tomorrow, then she should take today off. She hugged him and said the night smelled pleasantly of forget-me-not, and that its petals were as blue as his eyes. Everything seemed to be getting better, and the young man initially thought that Irene was just acting cautiously. Theo felt curious from the first time they met why the maid looked at him with that gaze. But everything came to this, and maybe that's why they are so close now, even though they have only known each other for a short time. Theo leaned towards the maid and gently kissed her on the lips. Everything was very strange, but at the same time very sweet. His Highness, Theo was the first person in the history of the Veronica Empire to change the temple's prophecy. And this is only possible through strong will and great risk. But now his future cannot be predicted. And this will save many lives. Irene looked out of the carriage window and, like a child, was delighted with the new places she saw. Once in the capital, she didn't go anywhere during her entire working time, but stayed only in the southern Imperial citadel. The maids traveled in the same carriage, according to her calculations. The journey from there to the temple would take approximately 1 hour. Irene looked out the window with admiration and thought about how many beautiful and magical miracles were happening outside the window. Basil and Theo were sitting in another carriage, and the knight cautiously watched the subordinate sitting opposite him. The master hinted that the subject was jealous of Irene, and that's why he didn't want to take her on the trip. He said that, compared to common people, he has quite a lot of knowledge of theology. Basilio said in a serious voice that perhaps Irene could be a spy from the temple, and that they should be careful with her. He claimed that a simple girl preparing to enter the academy could not have learned the language of the ancients so well. Even his father, who was a priest, did not know this language and could not read it fluently even after studying at the academy. Basil was sure that Irene seemed suspicious and tried to warn the knight not to make mistakes. One would think that if she were a spy, she would constantly be watching the knight, and everything would be clear. But she did not look like a church spy sent by anyone at all. But whatever the case, Basil was hard to convince and would always be extremely cautious and attentive. Irene and the maids arrived at the location, and the girl was surprised by how majestic the building was before her eyes. Theo got out of the carriage, looking from afar at the maid, who was delighted with the temple. The high priest was informed that the imperial carriage had arrived. His Highness had decided to begin the process of transferring the throne, and his first successor would be his eldest son, Evan. Prince Theo supported his brother's candidacy and silently listened to the solemn words of the ceremony. Princess Lauren stood among everyone and smiled sweetly, proud of her brother. The high priest greeted the imperial family and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Theo saw through the priest's soul and considered him an insolent old man blinded by power. The ceremony began, and the high priest stood in front of the bowed young master. He touched the child's head with his hand and recited a prayer. Irene had always wished to dedicate herself to faith, but as soon as she saw the ceremony, her heart shrank. The priest said that the second prince is completely healthy and thanked the church for their support. The man said that they had sent many letters to the knight, but had never received a single reply. And then Theo asked why it was written in an ancient language that no one understood. Theo knelt down and asked to begin the initiation ceremony right away. The priest said that it seemed the young knight would have to receive a new prediction. Shortly before this, Basil and Tio argued about whether it was necessary to go to the temple, and whether changes to the prediction could bring problems. Tio suspected that the high priest's true motives might be different from reality. The very act of changing the prediction is a hard blow to the church and its authority. That is why the letters were sent in the language of the ancients, so that no one could find out the meaning of the letter. And before the ceremony, the priest wanted to speak with the knight personally and discuss something. He hoped and planned to change the prophecy in advance so that he could use this knowledge for his own purposes. Suddenly, the church lit up with a bright light, as if the stars themselves had descended from heaven to illuminate the sacred temple. The rays penetrated through the stained glass windows, painted with magnificent colors, and created a play of light and shadow on the floor and walls, the air filled with warmth and a feeling of blessing, as if an invisible hand gently touched the hearts of the believers, reminding them of eternity and grace. Theo covered his face with his hand, and everyone present was blinded by a magical bright light. Irene also covered her face with her hand, but a pure white light spread throughout the temple. The glow surrounded Theo in a crazy whirlwind, creating a group of powerful energy around him. The prophecy was changed, but no one could understand who did it and how everything happened. The high priest assumed that this was a divine revelation, and the Almighty himself intervened in the fate of the master, restoring life to the young man. He decided to change his fate, but the maid was surprised. Theo was already blessed, but the priest was sure that the Almighty would not interfere in the fate of a simple man, and therefore something else must have been involved. Theo was something like his reincarnation, but that hadn't happened for over 1,000 years. After the ceremony, Irene, Theo, and the young man stood in the courtyard. The man in the church uniform was a boy named Bats. Suddenly, he placed his hand near the girl's lower back, which had been hurting for a long time, and a ball of light formed around the sore spot. Batten asked if her brother was causing trouble for the girl, and she was surprised to hear about the family connection. Suddenly, the young man realized how much he reminded her of him. The young man looked very much like Basil's subject. He reported that he had completed the treatment, and Irene felt that her lower back really didn't hurt anymore. Theo knelt in front of the lady, but Irene felt uncomfortable at such moments. She said that the thought that Theo had been blessed by the Almighty himself tormented her. Irene stated that she had previously studied theology and thought it was an incredible event she witnessed with her own eyes. Theo said she was an ordinary person, but the servant was indignant because the young man had great merits, and asked him never to talk about himself that way again. Theo observed the girl's sincere emotions and realized that Basil had taken everything wrong, and that this sweet lady could not be a spy. The next day, all the maids were discussing the previous day's ceremony, where Theo had received a blessing, and they called it an incredible miracle. Irene overheard that the ladies considered what happened as some kind of political ploy, and they didn't believe in the blessing. Theo and the maid were in his office, and the boy asked why she came rarely, and the reason for her absence turned out to be the night shift she was unexpectedly assigned the day before. The master asked if the girl would come more often if she didn't have difficult night shifts. He thought that the girl was deliberately lying to him to see the young knight less often. Theo had said from the beginning that he liked Irene's appearance, but she thought he only wanted to play with her. But with each passing day, he understood her line of thinking less, and after that night decided not to worry about it anymore, because the difference in their statuses was an insurmountable obstacle, and she still didn't understand what kind of relationship she and Theo had after everything that had happened. The maid was lost in thought and didn't notice how she was slowly pouring hot tea onto the young man's desk. She flinched and dropped the teapot from her hands, starting to apologize and frantically collect the pieces. Suddenly, Tia took the maid by the hand and asked her to stop collecting the broken teapot. The boy, suddenly feeling protective and affectionate towards the maid, took her easily into his arms. And trust, his movements were soft and careful, as if he didn't want to cause her the slightest discomfort. And at that moment, something special seemed to erupt between them, a feeling of closeness and mutual understanding that strengthened their bond. She moved to clean up the shards before anyone saw her, but the guy asked her to stay still and touch nothing. The maid had a deep cut on her leg, and Tio took out the first aid kit to treat the serious wound. This scene reminded the girl of the exact moment when he sat next to her on the bench 3 years ago. Theo asked what the girl was so lost in thought about that she didn't even notice she had hurt her leg. Irene apologized for being the head of the servants and making such stupid mistakes. And ridiculous. Tio replied that she thinks too little of herself because she is constantly cleaning, taking care of the master, helping with documents, and is constantly busy with something. Irene was worried because she bothered the master every day, but that was simply her job. Tia said that the girl always helps him with important matters, and that without her everyone would have been covered in dust a long time ago, and that he would be late for every meeting if she didn't prepare his clothes for him in advance every time. But Irene felt that all his words were meaningless. Servants should never make mistakes, and everyone knew it. But Tio continued to speak differently, and the girl felt as if he were taking care of her and comforting her. He asked her to call him by his name from now on, and to abandon all formalities. That night, the knights arrived at the agreed location and were supposed to reach the temple at dawn. But a girl was sure that this boded no good for Theo in the future. Irene knocked on the door of Theo's office, entered, and saw a girl who hadn't been there before. The stranger greeted the maid and looked in her direction with good intentions. She reported that bandits had captured the northern pass of Mount Camel. Negotiations had failed, and they had to face it in another way. Several sacred artifacts were stolen, which will soon be returned to the palace. On the way back, the church contacted her, where the girl went. Tio was surprised that the church personally contacted the lady and informed her that she was marked with the sign of the apocalypse. And now the church ministers are looking for an avatar for the young master to help him cope with the situation. The sign of the apocalypse is a rare phenomenon to which only those blessed by the Almighty are subject. And to receive the full divine blessing, a mediator between man was needed. God and the avatar. Anyone who has spoken to a blessed person can become an avatar. So the church contacted everyone who knew Theo, and they wanted to find a suitable avatar for the young man. According to the girl, this was a great concern for the church, and Irene was surprised to learn that perhaps they had already found the avatar. It was literally the descent of the Almighty to earth, and such an event could greatly change the course of history. But there was one main reason why they called the girl. They planned to reveal the mysterious identity of the avatar at Lord Theo's birthday party. The lady said that everything seemed very strange, but if the avatar had already been chosen, then it was a person extremely close to the knight. The maid asked permission to leave after the girl, who finished her report, and left. Theo stopped the maid and asked her to rest for a while, as she had been working all day, from morning until night. Irene said she still had a lot of work to do, and absolutely no time to rest, especially in his office. The girl seemed interested in the appearance of a certain avatar, but the boy didn't care at all. Theo said he was not at all interested in this topic, and that it didn't matter who blessed whom in the temple. Irene shared the impression that in his place, she would be very interested in the upcoming event. But Tio said he already had enough worries without that, and that it would be better for him to think about the maid at that moment. To make filling out paperwork less boring, the boy asked the girl to stay and talk to him. He suggested talking about her, and Irene told him that she had 5 children in her family. Her mother was always busy, and the girl took care of her brothers and sisters herself. And sisters, so she had a lot of experience in household chores. Her father died in the war when she was little, and her mother worked as a servant for an Eastern writer. One day she told me that the Imperial Palace accepts servants, and before leaving, she gave Irene a pair of homemade shoes. Theo listened attentively to her story and began to know the girl from a completely different side. He asked her if she communicated with her relatives, and the girl said that her salary was enough for them to live comfortably. Theo thought that she was responsible for her entire family, her mother, her brothers and sisters, and that explained why she prepared to enroll, but could never enter the academy. A thought crossed his mind. He was completely right, and Irene would never betray him. Basil stood in the gentleman's office and asked if he knew the news about the avatar's appointment. He handed the gentleman a piece of paper and told him that they had gathered all the information they could find about the maid. Theo looked at the papers, which contained nothing, and Basil confirmed that he had no reason to worry. He wanted the girl to prove to herself that she was not a spy, and asked his subject to handle the matter calmly, and strictly ordered that Irene under no circumstances should find out any details about anything or anyone. Theo suggested presenting the maiden at the ceremony, but Basil argued that the ceremony was an important event, and that it was not right to do so. After all, he was a prince who had recently received a blessing and held a very high status, and it seemed that the church wanted to build a connection with the master through the avatar, and the master said he was glad that Basil was on his side. The young man said he didn't need such connections, and the subject agreed with his opinion. Theo wondered why Basil sent Monet a bunch of letters when one was enough to tell him about Irene. He assumed that the young man simply liked the young lady and decided not to bother Basil with questions. The gentleman's suit was completely ready according to the new measurements, and Irene was next to the garment, and she was proud of the perfect job. The girl approached her with a report and asked if she would interfere with the maid in performing her duties. She was looking for records on the underdeveloped northern lands. The maid quickly found the correct book and gave it to the girl. She thanked her for her help and said that Basil had mentioned the maid's name in his letters. But the maid didn't understand what she was talking about. The girl reached out and said that she had seen him recently, but she couldn't introduce herself at the moment because she was busy. Her name was Monette, and the lady was His Highness's assistant. Irene introduced herself as the master's maiden and asked again about the letters she didn't know about. The girl said that Basil's subject sometimes wrote her letters, and in one of them he mentioned the maid's name. She didn't say anything special, but the girl suddenly asked if she and the knight were in love. Irene became very nervous, and in a trembling voice tried to say that the girl had misunderstood everything. But the lady reassured the maid and promised to keep the information a secret and tell no one. Irene admitted that she was very worried and asked the girl not to pay attention to Basil's words. The maid understood. Assistant Basil guessed everything, and rumors about their romance began to spread. She didn't expect him to tell anyone else, and was even afraid to think that someone else might discover their relationship, because then she and the master could have big problems. The girl moved away from the maid and thought that it was no wonder the prince fell in love with her, since Irene was very sweet and kind. Theo's long-awaited birthday arrived, and Irene helped with preparations from the morning. The ceremony was about to begin, and she carefully adjusted the red ribbon on the young man's chest. Guests from all over the world gathered in the palace to take part in the grand ceremony. Their bright outfits and smiles filled the spacious palace halls with a festive atmosphere. The majestic columns and luxurious patterns on the walls created an impression of sophistication and luxury, emphasizing the importance of the moment that brought them all together here. The emperor came out to the guests and thanked everyone present for their desire to congratulate his son on his birthday. He began by announcing, as everyone knew, that his son Theo had received a blessing from the Almighty, and only a divine incarnation was capable of revealing the full essence of his blessing. He asked the young lady to come out, and a beautiful girl appeared before the guests, radiating grace and elegance, dressed in a magnificent white dress, and her attire seemed created for this important moment, emphasizing her tenderness and grace. Every step of the girl was like a dance. Her movements were graceful and elegant, as if she were floating in the air. The guests' gazes were fixed on her. Their admiration was impossible to hide. The lady was the embodiment of beauty and sophistication, like a fairy tale princess, and her appearance added a special charm and allure to the evening, filling the air with notes of excitement and admiration. The priest introduced the new avatar to the emperor. The young lady greeted His Highness and bowed. Who would have thought that the church would assign a beautiful young lady to the master as an avatar? Irene saw the lady and was annoyed. Now her life will definitely have more trouble with the appearance of a beautiful stranger. She looked down sadly, and at that moment she felt a strange excitement about the appearance of the avatar. The fabric of her dress easily adapted to her figure, giving her image a light quality and airy, and the girl said it was a great honor for her to speak personally with the emperor. Princess Lauren observed everything from the balcony and was indignant because the girl came to the ceremony in a white dress, similar to a wedding dress. The crown prince patted his brother on the shoulder and told him to stop frowning on his birthday. Suddenly, Lauren turned to the boys and angrily asked why her brother hadn't even sent her a birthday card. And now she was there congratulating Theo. She tried to joke that many people had already congratulated the princess and that she shouldn't act like a poor child. The brother said with a satisfied smile that this day belonged to Theo and wished him to spend it with dignity. Evan was a rather attentive relative, but Lauren was bothered by the fact that the guests only cared about this girl. Many people would like to look luxurious during the holidays, and it has been a long time since a brilliant personality appeared in the palace. But the princess complained that everyone was gathered there for another reason, and that all the attention was focused on the avatar. Theo asked Basil to invite everyone he had appointments with, but he stopped in front of the avatar girl, whose name was Sonia Dale, and asked if she wanted to ask something. She said in a soft voice that she had come to meet the knight, but had not had the opportunity to do so until now. Sonia said that she and Theo would have to see each other often in the future, and that's why it would be better to get to know each other better. Theo said he wasn't sure about this and asked Irene to bring the documents, completely ignoring Sonia. He was going to continue with the important matter, and Theo didn't care about the avatar's appearance. Irene turned and saw the painfully familiar look of a young woman standing sadly to the side. That sad look reminded her how the maid had stood before Theo with the same expression before. The formal part of the ceremony over, Theo sat on the sofa and sighed deeply from fatigue. Irene stayed close and asked the knight not to touch the precious brooch on his suit so that the expensive thing wouldn't break. The maid helped the young man untie his tie and couldn't stop thinking about that mysterious girl turned avatar. Theo thanked the maid for playing along with him in the conversation so well, and now the young man felt much better. As Irene untied the knight's tie, he said he was tired of constantly bothering others, and that he needed to keep up appearances in public because he was part of the ruling family. Theo hugged the girl. That moment was filled with a special warmth and intimacy, as if time had stopped for the two of them. Everything around them froze, leaving only their exciting moment of exchanging tenderness. The maid felt her heart leap with happiness as she hugged the beautiful young man who had become her special person. And words were unnecessary, but the embrace spoke louder than any expression. She said she hadn't yet heard the girl's congratulations, and she tenderly thanked the young man for the opportunity to express her gratitude. Suddenly, Theo said that the maid should not work too hard and needed to rest because he had deliberately taken her far away, and the maid worked more than the master himself. Irene said that this is her direct responsibility and that she performs her job with pleasure. He turned around and looked thoughtfully to the side, saying that he needed her help. And it seemed he wasn't talking about work, but about the relationship between them, which became more complicated every day. Theo asked if he could kiss the girl, although he had never asked that question before, and acted decisively. The young man, filled with excitement and tender feelings, approached the maid and carefully hugged her. His embrace was warm and tender, as if he wanted to convey all his love and care to her. And the maid, smiling in response, hugged him back, feeling his tenderness and affection in his embrace. But Irene was very worried about the avatar. The girl had to bless him, but in Coin's words, there was some kind of problem in this matter. Theo admitted that he doesn't know why the church assigned this girl to him, and he himself recently found out that she will be his personal avatar. Irene thought for a moment and said, "Lady Sonia is very beautiful and fits this role well." The maid fastened his suit and asked if the young knight was tired after the ceremony. She was about to leave and said she had a lot of work tomorrow, but Theo stopped the girl and told her he didn't need help with the work. Theo shouted loudly. He only wanted Irene and kissed her passionately on the lips, not wanting to let her go anywhere else. The next morning, the boy lay silently next to the sleeping girl, his gaze fixed on her face as if lost in thought. In her calm features, he saw the reflection of a world full of softness and warmth, and her breathing was even and calm, like a melody that soothed his stormy thoughts. Suddenly, Basil entered the room without knocking, and Theo quickly ordered him to leave the dormitory. The subject didn't immediately understand what was happening and why he was being kicked out, since he intended to talk to the master. They left the room, but Basil managed to notice that the same maid was lying on the master's bed. He said that His Highness, the Emperor, wanted to see Theo right now for an important conversation at such an early hour. Basil had no idea why they wanted to see the knight, and said he was simply ordered to bring him. The young man looked at his watch and said they didn't have much time and that Theo should hurry and get ready. The carriage, crowned with gold and decorated with exquisite patterns, slowly stopped in front of the emperor's palace. The snow-white horses snorted softly, and their hooves resonated muffledly on the cobblestone street. A tall and majestic young man got out of the carriage. There was something incomprehensibly majestic and powerful in his gaze. His attire was the embodiment of luxury and power, and every detail of his image betrayed his high status and influential position. Theo was very interested to know why he had been summoned so early in the morning, and what the emperor wanted to talk about. The young man entered the garden where they were waiting for him, and thought that clearly the man had not called him for a reason related to the army. Usually at this hour Theo would be awake and training from early in the morning, but it seemed that Basil had told him everything now. Theo smiled and asked what the emperor wanted to talk about and suggested returning to the conversation. The man asked the young man what he thought about yesterday's birthday banquet. Theo said it was nothing special. There were just more people, alcohol, and music at the banquet than usual. The emperor asked Theo what he thought of the girl Sonia, who was present at the party yesterday as an avatar. He said that she was chosen by the Almighty, so she should be called holy, and considered her a quite sweet and modest girl. The emperor reported that a few days ago he had spoken with people from the temple, and they had reached a marriage proposal between Sonia and Theo. This marriage is very important for the empire, because thanks to it, the Imperial family and the temple will be able to enter into an alliance that will last for centuries. The emperor had spoken. He wanted the marriage not only for the sake of unity, but also because as a father, he was grateful to them for saving Theo's life. And he considered their marriage the ideal opportunity to express his gratitude. But the young man did not want to listen. He asked his son to think carefully and not act hastily, but Theo did not want to follow his father's example. Theo said he had made his decision and was not going to marry the girl the church had imposed on him. He was indignant because if they wanted to reward him so much for saving his life, they would have achieved better results by generously covering him with gold, instead of using him in a political marriage, pretending that it meant something to them. Theo did not want to listen to any more persuasion and asked permission to leave and continue with his affairs. Basil followed the knight and said he shouldn't have spoken so rudely, and Theo shouted that he really should return to fall at the emperor's feet, accepting a wedding that would benefit his father. Theo believes that marriages should be based on love, not political reasons. He didn't want to let this marriage take place at any cost, because his thoughts were occupied with a completely different girl. At that moment, Irene woke up in the master's room and was afraid that any moment one of the servants would enter. She needed to put her clothes in order, so she had to temporarily change into the master's robe. Suddenly, a voice came from behind the door and announced that it was entering the room, and Irene's heart instantly sank to her heels. A servant entered the room, brought things, looked around, and saw that the master was not in the room. The maid saw Raoul's servant and was surprised by his appearance, while the young man couldn't understand where Theo had disappeared so early. He hid behind the sofa and perfectly understood that if he drew attention to her, rumors would surely spread about her. Raoul brought the maid's uniform that the master had requested. He heard a strange noise under the bed and wondered if there were rats in the palace. At that moment, Theo entered the room. The servant greeted the master and told him that he had brought uniforms for the maids. He placed it on the table, and a frightened Irene sat under the bed next to him, praying that he wouldn't notice her. She gestured to the knight to remain silent, because her career could collapse in an instant. Raoul left the room, and the girl said that if the servant had seen her like this, she would definitely have told everyone immediately. Theo saw scratches on the girl's knee and asked when and where she got hurt. He offered the girl to apply an ointment so that the wound wouldn't become inflamed, and Irene felt pleased to feel the young master's care. Theo said that the girl seemed to be in a very good mood and that her bruise caused him no concern. He took out some ointment and kindly said that the lady needed to take care of herself even when he was nearby. It was very strange. At first, the girl found Theo to be a rude and unpleasant person, but the more she got to know him, the more convinced she became that Theo was actually a kind person. And good. She asked him where he had gone so early in the morning, and Theo said he had been at a meeting with the emperor. The girl thought his face had changed and really wanted to know what had happened, but she was sure that the master would hardly discuss his affairs with a simple maid. When she thought about it, she immediately began to worry about the difference in their statuses. And the boy said tenderly, the girl put on her clothes. She was worried because she grabbed the first thing at hand, but the master had thought about it in advance, and specifically asked for a clean uniform to be brought for the maid. He joked that he hadn't asked for the uniform for himself, and Irene was horrified imagining a knight dressed in a servant's uniform. Theo said it was time to go, and that Irene could take her time and get ready in peace. The knight left the door and paused for a minute. In his thoughts, she was the image of the ideal, the embodiment of everything he desired in his other half. Irene's smile lit up his heart like sunbeams piercing through the clouds, and her eyes were a mirror reflecting his own feelings and emotions, and his heart trembled at the thought of her caresses, as if each of them brought him infinite happiness. Irene got dressed and went out to fulfill her servant duties, and immediately ran into Raoul in the hallway. He was about to clean His Highness's room and was now heading there. Irene tried to act naturally and reported that the room was very messy and that she had succeeded in cleaning it. The servant asked if the maid had heard the important news that the maid Thelma urgently wanted to convey to him. Thelma and Raoul loved spreading rumors, but the girl knew she had to work hard first. Thelma burst into the servant's room and shouted angrily, asking if Irene had heard the news. She reported that all the servants had been talking about His Highness for the last few days. Thelma said that Tio was going to marry Lady Sonia, who was present at the banquet, and His Highness had already had a meeting with the high priest about it. Irene was surprised by the news she heard, as the Lord had not told her anything about it. Thelma claimed that she and His Highness were very close, so everything had changed since Sonia arrived, and she believed that they got along perfectly and were made for each other. Irene tried not to think about it, but the thought of how good she looked with the master did not leave her, and it only hurt her. A maid suddenly approached Thelma and told her that the master was looking for her. The maid Evra ordered her to leave the office and looked threateningly at Irene. She wanted to have a serious conversation with Irene and was afraid that her secret might be revealed. Evra put a cup of tea on the table and said that if Irene continued to behave stupidly, her secret would soon be revealed. She warned me not to let the other servants see me, and what Zelma said about the wedding was probably true. Irene thanked the maid for her concern and tried not to show her emotions. She felt that now was not the time to thank, and that the maid should think about her behavior. But Irene was in no condition to show her feelings, and considered it enough for her to be able to share her experiences with someone. Ebra perfectly understood the girl, but advised her to stay away from His Highness so as not to lose her job. But the mere thought of having to avoid the master caused real horror in the enamored young woman. Ebra said that the knight would marry another girl and would be with her from now on. Sonia was not just any lady, but belonged to the status of saints, and even if she and Tio had a special relationship, a connection with the master would only harm the young Irene and cause many problems. Ebra understood that the maid was worried and advised her to stop, follow her own path, and stay away from His Highness. Irene left the room, saw Tio, and thought that if these two were really engaged, all she could do was wish them happiness and forget everything that happened between them. She said that she had brought the documents, and that from that day on she was determined not to give in, and not to yield to the knight's tricks to stay. Irene bowed, wished the boy a pleasant rest, and told him that despite how late it was, she still had things to do. Theo approached her and said that someone was working overtime, but the maid insisted that she had a lot of work. He asked the girl not to leave and promised to take care of all matters and troubles, no matter what others said. Tio wanted to hug her, but Irene pushed the Lord and asked him to let her go right now. She looked at him with sad eyes and admitted that today she just wanted to leave. Irene apologized, but perfectly understood that she could no longer take risks and accept secret encounters. Tio asked about the girl's health and assumed she was tired, but the maid said she was perfectly fine. The master listened and dismissed the maid. She bowed and wished him a pleasant evening. Monet and Basil laughed as if Theo had been abandoned, but he stated that he had simply let the girl go because he was tired of all the worries. Theo stood there a little longer, lost in thought and reveries about their secret relationship. 2 days later, Irene continued to ignore the knight, and each time tried to invent a new excuse not to be alone. After this, a few more days passed, and the maid wondered how much longer they would play hide-and-seek with the master. She found it difficult to even hold his gaze, so the maid avoided contact in every possible way. Theo felt that the maid might be angry with him, so he asked her directly about it. Irene replied that she was not angry, but the boy couldn't understand why she had been acting so strangely in recent days. She had been trying to avoid Tio, and he had noticed, but now Irene was there. Not knowing what to say, the girl, whose eyes were filled with tears, said she wanted to end their close relationship. Her heart was beating fast, but she knew this decision was necessary. She understood that the decision to end the relationship would be difficult for both of them, but she believed it would be better. And she dreamed that each would find their happiness, even if it meant their separation. Theo did not bother her with questions. He lowered his gaze and said that the maid could leave. With difficult feelings and tears in her eyes, she left the office and decided that now was the time to free herself from the burden that their forbidden relationship had carried for a long time. She held in her hands the black handkerchief the knight had given her at their first meeting, and she understood that from that moment, everything was over. She was in no position to cry, but she could not hold back the bitter tears of farewell. Her tears flowed in a continuous torrent, like a stream carrying away all her grief and pain. She felt her heart breaking into pieces, and every breath was a reminder that he was no longer a part of her life. Irene understood that separation was inevitable, but this did not make her suffering any less acute. But now she was left alone, collecting the fragments of her heart and trying to come to terms with the new reality in which everything was destined to improve. She went to see the butler and told him that she wanted to take another job in the Imperial palace. Irene asked him to reflect on her request, and she has her personal reasons for this decision. The man thought that the maid had settled in as the master's personal servant, but everything turned out differently. He said he would think about her proposal and asked her to return to work as a servant. Irene knew she had done everything she could, and now all that remained was to extinguish her strong feelings for the master. Theo stayed in the office and listened to Basil's final report, about which he had given special instructions earlier. He reported that no rumors were circulating in the palace, only that the master's servants had a good reputation, and that he knew how to find worthy workers. Theo was surprised. There was no gossip about her, but now it remained to find out why Irene kept avoiding him. Every time he passed by her, the maid wouldn't look up and ignored the master. He felt like he was going crazy, because he couldn't even understand why the girl's eyes were so full of tears. Basil was silent for a moment and said that, in fact, there is another rumor about His Highness. There was a rumor in high society that Theo was going to marry a divine avatar. Maybe the rumors were false and someone was spreading them on purpose, and the young man didn't know whether to tell the knight such news. He observed that the subject was acting suspiciously and asked again if there were any rumors about him. He was glad that the maid had rejected the master first and said that maybe Theo had simply become boring to her. The young man was surprised and asked again if he really believed that Irene had ended their relationship only for that reason. Irene woke up early in the morning, but after yesterday, she didn't want this day to come. The farewell ceremony took place at the temple. Lady Monet warned that there might be many ears there, and it was worth refraining from unnecessary conversations. Irene felt very uncomfortable and wished the day would end quickly. The high priest stood next to the beautiful Lady Sonia and told her that they were very eager for the knight's arrival. Theo got angry when he saw Sonia and didn't understand why this girl was here again. The priest reported that Sonia herself expressed her desire to attend the ceremony, and that the emperor was very pleased with her honorable gesture. Theo was extremely rude and indignant at having to be present even on the day of his mother's funeral. The emperor asked Sonia not to worry, as the young man was simply having a difficult day today. The reason why he was behaving so rudely. Sonia smiled sweetly and said she would be happy to honor the memory of Empress Kant and support him. The guests were invited inside, but Irene was blocked by a priest who asked the girl to stop near the entrance. He warned that no one else could attend the farewell ceremony and that she would have to wait outside. Irene thought perhaps this was a sign from above indicating that she should no longer approach His Highness or be near him. The maid went for a walk in the summer garden and on the way met an acquaintance named Batten, who recognized her and greeted her. He said that His Highness was currently at a ceremony and that he would like to find a secluded place to pray in his free time. She was informed that the ceremony would last more than an hour and that she would like to say a prayer to soothe her soul. The priest led Irene to the prayer room, where the presence of servants was allowed. Batten asked the girl to settle in the temple's prayer room and left to do some business. Irene folded her hands in front of her and began to read a prayer. Her voice was heard by a young man lying on a bench with a book. He got up and saw a beautiful and sweet girl who was praying for His Highness to be healthy in body and spirit. Lady Monette, who couldn't find anything to do because she was not a religious person, passed by the temple. She looked through the open door and saw Irene, and a strange magical light emanated from her as she prayed. The girl was sitting with her arms crossed over her chest, her mind full of prayers and gratitude, and her heart of purity of intention. An invisible energy pulsed in her chest, like a burning torch illuminating the inner world, and as she sank deeper into her prayers, something extraordinary began to appear around her. A faint, soft, and warm light began to penetrate through her closed eyelids, and filling the room, it surrounded the girl, as if embracing her with invisible hands, and filled her soul with hope and comfort. Suddenly, Irene heard the voice of a stranger who had just greeted her. This young man's smile was like a magnet attracting attention and making hearts palpitate, and his natural charisma and self-confidence made him irresistible. The maid turned and looked at the stranger with frightened eyes, not expecting to see anyone else there. The young man stood up, approached the maid, and asked what the beautiful girl's name was. Irene saw this young man for the first time and couldn't understand who was speaking to her. He seemed special. His clothes were made of expensive fabric, and it was unclear why a high-status person would need to know her name. The young man said he didn't want to inconvenience the lady and introduced himself. His name was Hallie's Tilford. Aaron realized that the Tilford family was one of the marquis families of the Veronica Empire, and he became marquis and head of the family when his predecessor suddenly died. She introduced herself as His Highness's head maid and said she had come for the ceremony. The young man offered his hand to the lady and asked if she would like to walk and talk with him on the street. They were walking along a forest path near the temple, and the boy said they had chosen a wonderful place for a walk. Irene wasn't looking where she was going, tripped, and fell right on top of the stranger walking in front of her. The maid tried to move away from him quickly, thanked him for saving her, and said she was fine. The boy smiled and said that even in such a situation, a lady must not forget her good manners. He asked if the maid would be there until the end of the ceremony, and politely agreed to be called informally if she felt comfortable doing so. Irene asked if they would see each other again, but the young man couldn't promise anything and just smiled. The boy said that judging by the girl's prayer, she worried about many things in vain, and promised not to tell anyone. The young man shared that faith does not fade just because one opens their heart to it, and when one has problems, they go to the temple to calm their mind, and today he was lucky to meet her. He said he would stay in the capital for a few days, and they say many people find their avatars in the temple. And it seemed that Sonya Dale had not prayed for 2 whole years for the healing of His Highness's wounds. While he fought on the battlefield, as much as Hales thought about it, it seemed strange to him that the only way to receive a blessing was to speak with him. But Sonya clearly wasn't the only one Theo had spoken to, and she also seemed impatient. He also spoke to her and watched from afar, and the girl seemed just like an ordinary aristocrat, and common, not a deity. And now they called her divine avatar, and everything became even more interesting than he thought when he saw Irene now. What he had just seen in the temple proved nothing, but Hyles suggested to the maid that they should meet again alone. He trusted his inner voice and wanted to test his conjectures, but it seemed Irene misunderstood the message of their next meeting. Suddenly, she felt a strong hug over her and was surprised to see Tio in front of her. She looked at the boy and asked what they were doing there, without taking her menacing gaze off Hales. Tio looked tense and wanted to know the reason why his maid and the boy were together in the woods. The celebration was still going on, and Irene was worried because the knight was not at the ceremony. She said she wanted to pray, and in the temple they had a conversation with Marquis Stilford. That's why they are here. It seemed the knight did not hear the boy introduce himself and hurried to greet him again. Theo made no attempt to hide his displeasure towards him, and the stranger was surprised that the knight behaved this way because of the maid. He announced that it was time to leave, and Irene hurried to follow the knight to the ceremony. Tio looked angry and walked quickly and silently towards the temple, while the maid tried to catch up with him. Suddenly he turned and hugged the girl. In that moment of exchanging emotions and energy, time seemed to stop, and he felt the maid's heart beating in unison with his own, creating harmony and unity. He began to ask her who that stranger was, and if she really saw him for the first time in her life. Irene became nervous. Perhaps the master was angry because of her constant refusals, but in reality, she only ran into Tilfad at the temple. The girl did not understand what the difference was with her talking to the young man if Tio had already found a partner anyway. The boy was visibly nervous, and Irene, unable to contain her emotions, shouted that the Lord was just playing with her. She said with tears in her eyes that Tio took advantage of her, knowing how she felt. And now he was going to marry someone else. The girl started crying, and she didn't understand what to do now, and admitted that she had been trying for a long time to get him out of her heart. But Tio stroked her face and told her that he had never lied to her and had always told her the truth. He swore and asked her who she thought his chosen one was, since she was talking about marriage. Irene reported that everyone was talking about his wedding with the divine avatar, and one of his close associates announced it. Tio seemed to understand everything and asked again if that was really the only reason she was ignoring him. He approached her and Irene was afraid they would be seen. But the young man insisted there was no one there. The boy whispered words in her ear that the maid never expected to hear from her master. He looked her in the eyes and said confidently that he had given up the wedding a long time ago, and that he had no union with the Avatar. Theo said that as soon as the Emperor raised the issue, he rejected his orders without hesitation. Irene asked why everyone was talking about it then, and the young man was about to find out. No one except his father could spread rumors about this, and now there should be no misunderstandings between him and Irene. The young man shared that he was really worried about Irene and had been restless all these days. He asked her if by chance Irene thought that he treated her only as a servant, and if that were the case, he wouldn't constantly be trying to get her attention, and wouldn't be an idiot who doesn't know what he feels. Theo confessed that he could no longer live without the girl. His heart beat faster when he looked into her eyes, experiencing mixed feelings of excitement and fear, but he knew it was time to open up and share his true feelings. Irene began to cry with happiness and did not think that she would ever hear a declaration of love from His Highness. When she smiled back at him, her heart shone with joy, knowing that they were together now, united by these sincere feelings, and this moment became the beginning of their incredible journey together, filled with love, care, and mutual respect, despite the fact that the status difference did not disappear and still separated them. At that moment, the high priest shouted at Sonia and was indignant that such a useless girl could go and make His Highness fall in love with her. She knew she couldn't control the feelings of others, but the temple minister had just ordered her to do so. According to him, he deliberately made her a divine avatar because the girl had previously spoken of her love for the master. He asked her to figure out how to win Theo's heart and told her that he believed in her reasonable behavior. Hollies traveled in the carriage and thought about the ambiguous relationship between the maid and the master. Prince Theo was alarmed by her and the boy's walk, and their quarrel seemed to indicate that they were in love with each other. And the young man thought it was interesting, and he could take advantage of it. Irene brought the night tea with sweets. He asked her to rest, but the girl insisted on the importance of work. Theo tried to persuade her to ask the servants to do the work, but the maid felt uncomfortable asking others to do her chores. She turned around and said it would be better to finish everything now and leave work early. Theo hugged the girl tightly and was glad that she could finish early and be with him. The master kept tenderly kissing the maid, who was trying with all her might to escape his hands. Theo didn't want to let her go and said that his heart was filled with strange sensations due to their closeness. The boy's eyes reflected genuine happiness and sincere emotions when communicating with Irene. He took her hand and placed it on his chest so that she could hear the frantic beats of his excited heart. His heart was really beating fast, and every moment with Irene was incredible for him. Lady Monette had been standing outside the door the whole time and wondered if Irene was the master's real avatar. The next morning, the maid was busy with her work, trying to carry a huge stack of heavy papers. Monette wanted to follow the maid and confirm her divine connection with the master. She was staring intently at Irene when Basilio saw her and asked what the lady was doing there. It seemed Monet had guessed that they had made up with His Highness and had even stopped being angry with everyone. Basilio supposed that all this would probably end badly and was sure that something strange was happening in the situation. He said it would be better not to jump to conclusions until it was resolved, and Lady Monette agreed with his opinion and decided to find out everything. Irene was carrying a heavy stack of papers and couldn't see anything in front of her until she bumped into someone walking towards her. The folders with documents fell from her hands, and the maid hurried to pick them up. But a young man rushed to her aid. She looked up and saw the Marquis standing in front of her, who said, now they met again. He helped Irene collect all the documents and asked if she could handle such a heavy load alone. Hollis asked her not to worry and asked if it was necessary to take the documents to His Highness's office. Irene asked if the Marquis was not busy with anything, but he said he still needed to meet the master. He asked what was going on between her and Theo, and seemed worried about their secret relationship. The young man turned everything into a joke and apologized, but Irene seemed very amused when she was nervous. He had planned to meet under different circumstances and hadn't expected to meet so suddenly, and said that the meeting was destined to happen when Irene herself wanted it. And if it was a coincidence, the meeting would then be inevitable. He said simple things with complex words, and when they approached the office, the maid asked him for the documents and thanked him for his help. The Marquis smiled and said he hoped their next meeting would happen soon in a different setting. Irene asked the boy not to address her so formally anymore, and he replied that he would think about her request. The girl watched the young man for a while and thought that this man seemed quite strange. She had been mistaken in assuming that meetings with the Marquis would be rare. But since then, he had constantly appeared in her way. Irene did not understand what the young man was trying to demonstrate, but this time she admitted that he was interested in her. And the strangest thing was that she didn't immediately understand this and didn't notice the signs of attention that Hales showed. Irene looked at the boy surprised. Her eyes were wide open and her eyebrows were arched. Her gaze reflected a mixture of surprise, bewilderment, and a bit of curiosity, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was ready to express her surprise, but the words were trapped somewhere on the verge of silence. She turned around and said she would pretend she hadn't heard the words the young man had just uttered. The guy seemed to impress her to cause such a reaction, and he asked why the lady reacted this way. Irene was sure of her feelings and knew perfectly well that for a long time she had a predilection for that night. So she wished the young man a good day and hurried to leave. Hollis realized that the girl would not open her heart to the first person she met and would not fall for his tricks. A very strange relationship was established in the Veronica Empire between the Imperial family and the church. Now their relationship depends entirely on the emperor's goodwill towards the church, and the throne is occupied by a deeply religious man. And if he finds out that the avatar offered by the church is fake, and in fact there is another real avatar, he will generously reward whoever points it out. Hale's plan was very well thought out, so the boy decided that now was the time to leave the city for a while. Theo stood by the window the whole time and watched as Lord Hales conversed pleasantly with the maid. Angrily, he told Basil that he disliked the Marquis constantly drawing attention to her. Theo looked out the window again and pointed at Marquis de Tilford without hiding his indignation towards him. Basil warned and repeatedly asked the knight to call the Empire's people by their names and not resort to insults. Theo didn't feel the need to know, but the subject insisted that, as a member of the Imperial family, he should be polite, and lately the knight had been the subject of many glances in high society. Theo suggested that maybe he was coming here to see Irene. This thought immediately caused a storm of negative emotions in him, and the master wanted to talk to the maid face to face. He burst open the door with all his might and shouted the maid's name, wanting to find out the whole truth as soon as possible. Irene was startled to hear the master's angry voice and looked at him for a moment with frightened eyes. Theo took her hand and informed her that the girl needed to put her matters aside and that he needed to talk to her urgently. He pushed her onto the bed, and the maid looked at the young man with surprise and clumsiness. Her expression reflected a mixture of astonishment, bewilderment, and some embarrassment, and the young man seemed not to notice or pay attention to her awkwardness. Theo looked the girl in the eyes and asked if she had just seen the Marquis in the garden. He asked why Tilfot came to see her, and Irene told him that they had run into each other quite often lately. The master asked what they talked about, but the maid had nothing to hide, and she told him the whole truth about her relationship with Hales. Irene reported that the Marquis had helped her, but Theo did not take her words well and started getting angry. But the girl tried to explain to him that there was nothing wrong with the communication and that the knight should not be so angry. In any case, she admitted that she only belonged to him and that she liked only the master. The girl finally decided to take a bold step and confessed her sympathy for the young man. Irene's voice sounded a little shaky with emotion as she expressed her feelings, and hope and restlessness flickered in her eyes. Theo listened attentively to her words. His face expressed mixed emotions: surprise, joy, and perhaps a little fear of new feelings. He responded with a smile full of sincere recognition and hugged her tightly, confirming the importance of her feelings. Theo admitted that he was simply afraid that the Marquis would fall in love with her and, in reality, he didn't understand why the maid trusted him so much. The knight took the girl's hand and told her that he liked that she did so much for him and cared about him. It was difficult for Theo to explain the reason for his strong sympathy, and he couldn't express all the feelings he had for that lady. He admitted that at one point he began to constantly look forward to meeting Irene because he fell deeply in love. The boy silently looked into the girl's eyes, his gaze filled with warmth and tenderness, and his eyes reflected the sincerity and depth of the feelings he had for her. He saw beauty and vulnerability in her, and his heart filled with awe for this incredible girl. The seconds dragged by as if they were in their own world, where only the two of them existed. And Irene whispered that her meeting with the Marquis was just a coincidence. She didn't want the knight to worry, so she gently stroked his face and asked him not to worry about it. Irene confessed that her heart belongs only to the master and that she is not interested in anyone else. After a while, Theo, Basil, and Monette were in the office, and the girl asked since when the Marquis had been showing signs of attention towards Irene. Hales seemed interested in the maid after the farewell ceremony, and Monet wondered if the Marquis had also seen Irene's divine manifestation in the prayer room. At that time, the atmosphere in the conversation became tense, and the master was indignant that his subjects were standing there and were silent, but no matter what, he knew that Irene had confessed her feelings to him. And that was the most important thing. At that moment, Irene was walking in the garden and approached the gardener to help her pick a beautiful bouquet. She said she forgot to change the water in the vase, and the previous flowers dried up the plants. They are very sensitive creatures that require constant care and water changes. The gardener approached the maid with a delicate rose in his hands. He handed her this symbol of love and beauty with a warm smile on his face and asked her to follow him. Suddenly, a breathless servant ran up to them and told the gardener to wait a moment. He excitedly asked if the gardener could urgently check the decorations in the banquet hall. The man smiled and told the maid that he would be away for a while, and in the meantime, she could choose a bouquet of flowers she liked. The maid happily picked up a bouquet of colorful and fragrant flowers. Each choice reflected her care and attention to detail. Irene slowly looked at each flower, choosing the most beautiful and fresh among them. Her fingers skillfully handled the delicate petals, creating a harmonious composition from them, where each flower in the bouquet had its own special meaning, whether a symbol of tenderness, joy, or hope. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought it would be nice to decorate His Highness's office with fresh flowers. But her thoughts were interrupted by Hale's voice, who accidentally appeared once more next to her. Irene was startled by such a sudden appearance, but she composed herself and greeted the Marquis. He asked what the lady was doing there, and the maid replied that she had come to pick a bouquet of flowers. The boy calmly watched her work, not wanting to distract her, but at the same time silently expressing his admiration. His eyes shone with the recognition that the young woman was capable of creating something special and beautiful even in such ordinary moments. Hollis thought that the maid was a little nervous, so he decided not to pressure the young woman too much. He sat down next to her and asked if she had correctly understood that the lady wanted to pick a beautiful bouquet. Hales decided to help her and picked up a flower, but the maid said it was better to cut the flowers instead of uprooting them. He asked her if she liked flowers, and Irene happily replied that there wasn't a person in the world who wouldn't like them. She loved picking flowers and said they smell good and can brighten everyday life. Irene looked at the young man and asked if he didn't get tired of the boring daily routine. Hales was very tired. The young man had a lot of work, and sometimes the joy of success was replaced by severe boredom. The maid told him with a happy smile how pleasant the roses smelled, and the Marquis suddenly felt a strange excitement inside while standing next to the beautiful girl. Irene loved plants and treated them with care, so she really wanted to show the beauty of the flowers to someone else. She cut a red rose for the Marquis and said she now hoped he would stop being so indifferent towards the plants. The maid took the collected bouquet in her hands and said it was time to leave, because she still had many things to do. Her smile lit up when the young man accepted her rose with tenderness and gratitude, and the moment was filled with mutual respect and joy thanks to simple but significant gestures of attention. Irene turned around and announced it was time to leave, leaving the young man alone with his overwhelming feelings of warmth and joy. On the way, the maid met an acquaintance servant who asked her where she had been for so long. She seemed excited and said that the same girl who was at the ceremony had arrived. Irene didn't immediately understand who they were talking about, but judging by the frightened maid, she realized that someone very important had arrived. It turned out she was right. A deuce arrived at the palace who was designated as the master's divine avatar. Theo was sitting in his office, hands folded, asking why the young woman had come to his palace. Sonia smiled sweetly and said she felt that she and the knight hadn't been able to say a proper goodbye on that occasion at the ceremony. She wanted to see Theo and talk to him in person because they now had a special relationship. The young man was clearly not happy to see her, and Sonia was worried that the knight wouldn't like the fact that she had visited him with good intentions. Tio spoke rudely. Now it doesn't matter whether he likes her visit or not. Sonia felt uncomfortable speaking, but she wanted to discuss the ceremony and admitted she wanted to improve her relationship with the knight. Almost immediately after graduating from the academy, she joined the temple outside the temple. Sonia was an ordinary girl, but in the church itself she always held a low position, so she was treated poorly. Her usual days were tough, and one day the girl's life suddenly changed when someone threw a ball at her. Then Sonia got scared and closed her eyes, seeing a ball flying out of nowhere straight towards her head. At that moment, Theo defended the girl, and shouted threateningly that you can't throw balls at people. Since then, Theo has become a special person for Sonia, because she saw support in him and care, and now she has become his special divine avatar, and it will take the young master a little effort to finally notice her and start perceiving her as a girl. Sonia was an educated and pleasant lady, and with a smile on her face, she said she had come to see His Highness. Irene knocked on the door with a tray and told the knight that she had brought hot tea. The maid felt uncomfortable when she saw Sonia, and it was obvious that she was trying to show some attention to her master. Now Irene and Sonia were in the same office, and Theo loudly declared that he was not going to marry her, so that the maid could hear it live and no longer doubt his words. He asked Sonia not to count on his close relationship, and Irene was very surprised to hear this. Theo said that he and Sonia had discussed everything and that she should leave his office, since the conversation between them was over. He said he was very busy, and Sonia felt very annoyed by the knight's rude behavior at that moment. Sonia couldn't order her heart not to feel feelings for the master, but she couldn't force someone else to feel sympathy for her. Irene saw that the divine avatar wanted to be with Prince Tio, but his denials made the girl cry. When she cried, she reminded Irene of her condition a few days ago, but the maid understood that the lady only wanted to find her happiness. Tio waited until Irene was alone in the office. He noticed that the maid seemed very sad. He asked her if everything was okay with her, but the girl didn't want to lie to him and admitted she was upset. The knight took the tray from her hands and asked if it was because she had just been with Sonia. His lips gently brushed against the girl's hand, making her tremble and feel a slight agitation. He looked into her eyes, saw surprise and embarrassment in them, and asked if she was jealous. Theo continued kissing her hand and said he would never marry Sonia, even if it was the emperor's will. They looked into each other's eyes, as if their entire soul was hidden in those eyes. Their gazes reflected tenderness, warmth, and mutual understanding, and words became unnecessary at that moment. Since all feelings were transmitted through glances and caresses, they believed that their love would be stronger than any life trial. Because when two people believe so unconditionally in their feelings, then nothing can interfere with them. Irene admitted that she was indeed very jealous when she found out that Sonia had come to visit Tio. But the maid perfectly understood what the girl felt, whose feelings were not reciprocated at all. She admitted that she felt great happiness because the knight felt sincere sympathy for her. He lifted her in his arms like a soft feather, and her heart beat to the rhythm of his touch. Their eyes met in an instant, as if they were on the edge between worlds, where time slowed down to capture every moment and every breath. In that moment when their souls became one, Tio saw a whole world of secrets and passions in Irene's eyes and smiled, feeling the pulsation of her heart in his hands. And she responded with the same warmth of her gaze, and their contact was not just physical. It penetrated deeper to the very core of their being, uniting them with the magic of inexpressible affection. The next day, the prince went straight to the emperor to tell him about the strange rumors circulating in the palace. His Highness was surprised to see his son, who was clearly in the mood for a serious conversation. He spoke about the rumors circulating among the emperor's subordinates about his imminent wedding. Tio approached his father and once again announced that he would not marry the divine avatar Sonia. His Highness did not want to create a conflict with his son, so he tried to behave with restraint. The young man did not understand why his father had asked him to think about the proposal before, but he himself was already sure that they would get married. But the father insisted that his son should be grateful to the avatar, thanks to whom he now enjoyed perfect health. The emperor was sure that Tio would be better off marrying a divine avatar, instead of doing what he wanted. When his mother died, the emperor took great care of his son and did everything possible to make the child's life happy. Theo understood that, when his father heard the prediction about his son's imminent death, it was very difficult for him. But now he has admitted that he wants something different in his life and is following the call of his heart. Not calculation. Perhaps before he would have agreed to fulfill his father's will. But now Teo could not abandon the girl for whom he felt strong feelings. After meeting Irene, his life changed, and he could not imagine his future without her. Teo did not lie and confessed to his father that he already had a girlfriend whom he liked very much, so he was against marrying another girl. But he said that for now, he was forced to keep her name a secret and promised to introduce them in the near future. The emperor understood that he could not force his son to marry and love another girl. Teo asked him to inform the church that he disagreed with his decision and that he would not form an alliance with the Avatar. Monette hoped that Teo would come from the emperor to discuss an important matter and asked how the conversation went. The knight suddenly turned and asked her what she thought about his wedding with Irene. Monette was surprised that Teo told His Highness everything, but warned her father not to know who Irene was. She was a little afraid that the emperor would react with anger, and that would complicate the girl's life. Monette confirmed her fears, and the aristocrats could also interfere in her destiny to the point of driving her out of the palace. She believed that not everyone in the palace had opinions as noble as the master's. Maybe Teo will manage to persuade his father, but will he be able to marry the maid if the entire aristocracy opposes their union? Irene only opened her heart to him, but the problems didn't end there. She did not expect so many complications due to the difference in status and their relationship. But Monet offered His Highness a way to solve this problem, and Theo looked at her with interest. Monet said that she recently saw Irene praying in the temple, and something strange happened. Theo interrupted the girl's words and said that a curious puppy had been a monstrosity for several days. Monet agreed. She and Tilford had started seeing each other a lot lately, which was very strange. Theo immediately realized that he was not just walking in the garden, but was specifically looking for the maid. Monette suggested asking the Marquis personally why he was constantly near her, but the lady first wanted to see how this cunning guy would behave with Irene, and then everything would become clear immediately. Hollis approached the maid, who was surprised that the Marquis was also in the garden today. The Marquis, with a smile on his face and bright eyes, asked the girl with interest how she was, and his questions were attentive, and his comments thoughtful, as if he were eager to know more about her, her dreams, aspirations, and hobbies. Emotions. Irene was surprised when the young man told her that the flower he gave her was very beautiful, and he put it in his office. He smiled and said he couldn't throw away what a young lady had given him with a good heart. Irene was delighted and began to tell how she tried to propagate flowers using cuttings. She showed a flower pot with a flower and explained that for a new flower to grow, it is necessary to replant a branch of the plant. Hollis leaned closer to the girl, pretending to examine the flower, and the lady immediately became embarrassed by such unexpected closeness. Theo, standing at a distance, watched the Marquis's behavior without taking his malicious gaze off him. He and Monette approached Hales and the maiden. The Marquis bowed and greeted the prince. Theo continued to stare at the young man, who had just been chatting pleasantly with his maid. He informed Irene of the upcoming meeting and asked her to prepare everything necessary while he stayed there, and spoke personally with the Marquis. The prince did not want to torture himself with conjectures, so he decided to ask the boy directly about his relationship. Hales began to appear frequently in the prince's palace, and Teo said he clearly hadn't come there for him. He openly asked him if the young man was attracted to his maid, with whom he constantly sought the right moment to talk. The Marquis admitted that he was indeed interested in Irene, but not with the interest the knight had thought. Theo wanted to know what interest was being discussed, and why the young man sought a meeting with Irene. The prince was not going to listen to any more nonsense and ordered Hales to stop lurking around his maid. But the young man insisted that the knight should not worry, and that he was not attracted to Irene as a girl. Hales said that he tried to get to know Irene from a different perspective to truly understand her and see her essence. Monet wondered if Hales knew everything about the maid's divine manifestation. Theo frowned and didn't understand why this young man said the same thing as Basil. The Marquis said he didn't have the right to tell the master everything yet, and Theo thought the insolent was clearly making fun of him. The prince's eyebrows furrowed in an angry frown. His gaze burned with fury like dragon fire, ready to be unleashed. Indignation held him in cold shackles, penetrating every cell of his body. The prince's heart beat loudly like a war drum, ready to declare battle to the whole world. and he asked why the Marquis simply didn't explain what was going on. Hales bowed and said he couldn't confirm anything until his suspicions were confirmed by facts. Theo was very angry, and nothing could stop him in the rage that enveloped him like a whirlwind of fire, ready to burn everything in its path. Hollis apologized to him and said he would be truly happy if Irene turned out to be a divine avatar, but he had to understand this for himself before reporting to the royal house. If he rushed, he could be destroyed not only by his own family, but also by the church. So the young man was not going to act without thinking. After the conversation, Theo entered the palace and angrily hit the wall, not understanding why the Marquis. And Basil suspected something about the maid. Monet was no longer going to hide information from the knight, and said she needed to talk to him urgently. The knight asked how important the conversation was, and suggested the girl talk later. But Monet was indignant. The conversation had to take place now, and there was no time to postpone it any longer. At first, she apologized, and said that at first she couldn't believe what she saw. But I must say that the Marquis has good reasons to doubt Irene, and that is why he treats her with such closeness. He tried for a long time to understand what kind of person Irene really was. It happened during the farewell ceremony when she looked towards the temple and saw a servant there. He said he found Irene praying, and it was as if butterflies were flying around her. There was a lot of magical light around her, and it was like a miracle, as if a sign of revelation had appeared. Theo thought and listened attentively to everything Lady Monet told him, confident in the uniqueness of the simple girl. Basil described how this sign manifested itself, and that the magical light was very similar to the description. Theo shouted. The Marquis also saw everything and was in the prayer temple that day. Judging by what the Marquis said, it was clear that he also saw Irene that day, and that's why he now spends so much time by her side. He decided to approach her immediately after seeing the sign of revelation, which is why he now relentlessly pursues the girl. Monet reported that at that moment, the maid was sitting in the prayer room and was praying sincerely. Theo thought it was strange that the maid knew the ancient language of Almacta, and that day he quickly read the letter from the church. Now, the knight frankly did not know who the maid really was, and too many different opinions were already circulating about her. But Theo knew it was too early to draw conclusions and consider Irene's behavior suspicious. He decided to ask Basil his opinion on the matter, as he was one of the first to suspect something about the maid. He said that Basil thought the girl was a spy for the church, and that if Irene found out, she would be very upset. Theo warned that Basil should not know about this yet, and that the only important thing was that such phenomena were truly unusual. The knight was indignant at being the last to know about everything, and decided not to miss the next meeting with the Marquis. Irene was very afraid that the situation could worsen even more, and she hoped that the conversation with the Emperor would go well. Since there was still no news about it, she was very worried, but tried to convince herself that probably not everything was as bad as she thought. In reality, the girl had done nothing wrong, but for some reason she now felt extremely disgusting. She felt the prince's sympathy and did not want to lose him over some misunderstanding. Suddenly she saw Sonia in the hallway, standing near the window and looking thoughtfully into the distance. She seemed to want to see Theo again and asked where the prince was now. Irene reported that His Highness was busy and had not informed them of his next meeting. The maid said that the master was now in an important meeting and suddenly felt strange being alone with Sonia. Sonia asked if perhaps the knight was avoiding her, but Irene convinced her that she was wrong. She suggested that the maid wait with her, so as not to get too bored in the agonizing wait. Now that she had seen the divine avatar, Irene realized that even if the prince liked her, he would never marry a commoner. Beautiful Sonia smiled, and sparks of joy played in her eyes, like stars in the night sky. Her smile was like a gentle breeze, bringing freshness and joy to everyone around her. And at that moment, it seemed that the whole world was filled with light and warmth. She offered to talk to Irene, but the maid preferred to accompany Sonia to His Highness's office. The girl felt annoyed by Sonia's appearance and felt very stupid, so she took the girl straight to the master's office. When the prince kicked her out, she declared that she could not accept the refusal, and that is why she appeared at the palace again. Irene suggested that the lady sit down and wait a while until His Highness finished his meeting. Sonia politely thanked the girl for her care and attention and agreed to wait a little while. She said she remembered Irene the day she brought tea, and that was when many things happened. Sonia said she regretted never having tried the tea prepared by the maid. She asked if Irene was really the closest maid to His Highness and wanted to know something about her. It seemed the maid knew the master well, and Sonia decided to turn to her for help. She was curious to know Tio's preferences, and Irene thought about her question for a moment. She fell silent for a while and realized that she didn't even know, and she wasn't interested in what the knight liked. She felt embarrassed and said that she liked tea, but couldn't think of anything else about his hobbies and tastes. She liked the prince very much, but the girl didn't even know anything about his things or favorite activities. She was upset, which means her feelings are not so strong, and this sweet girl is so attentive to every little thing. Irene felt nervous and shaky, so she wanted to leave quickly and said she would go find out the end time of the meeting. The maid noticed that Sonia did not hide her curiosity and remained interested in the master, and she and he seemed to be from different worlds. The maid walked slowly, tormented by her thoughts, but suddenly a man's hand stopped her. It was Theo who, in an instant, hugged the sweet girl and held her tightly against him. Irene was scared, but the young man immediately rushed to reassure her. No one would see them there. The meeting had ended a long time ago, and all the guests had already left, so they were completely alone. To make sure the lady wasn't worried, they entered the knight's office, and he asked her to come closer. He was interested in what the girl was doing. She sat on his lap, and he was worried because he needed to warn the knight that Sonia Dale was waiting for him. Theo asked her if there was anything she wanted to tell him, but the girl was too nervous to even speak. He asked if the girl seemed worried, and if someone had accidentally offended her in his absence. The boy leaned down and whispered. It seemed he didn't know much about the sweet and innocent girl. Irene asked why the knight thought so, since she had no secrets from him. She admitted that she would like to get to know the young man better, because they don't know much about each other. But Theo continued to hug the girl and couldn't deny the desire to touch her. He wished their hug would never end, but now was not the best time. Irene became more and more tense with every passing minute, and it seemed she was not telling the knight something. But it was no longer possible to wait, and the maid reported that Lady Sonia Dale was looking for him, and that she was here now. Irene conveyed the message that the lady had arrived and wanted to see the knight in person. Theo didn't like the girl's stubbornness, because he personally ended all discussions yesterday. It was obvious that Sonia was not going to give up to His Highness, and was willing to do anything to get his attention. Theo said that he recently spoke with the Emperor, and told him that he would not marry Sonia. He took Irene's hand, and confessed that he already had a girlfriend whom he liked very much. The boy gently touched the girl's hand and brought it to his lips. He kissed her as if pouring all his tenderness and care into her, and the maid felt the warmth of his lips on her skin, and closed her eyes, enjoying the moment, and at that moment there was nothing else for them except the two of them. And this gentle kiss. Irene couldn't believe what she heard, that the knight had confessed his feelings for another girl to his father. Theo really didn't intend to marry Sonia, so he immediately told his father. Irene looked at the boy with eyes full of happiness and tears, and her gaze reflected great joy, gratitude and love. She saw his support and backing in him. Her eyes shone with light and warmth, filling her heart with joy and confidence in their connection. He tenderly hugged her and whispered that she shouldn't worry anymore, because his heart only belonged to her. Irene was worried. Sonia was still waiting, and the young man asked her why she let her in there. But the maid was not in a position to give orders and told the master. Theo understood that the meeting was inevitable. In any case, he needed to go talk to Sonia. He decided to tell her the same thing he told his father, and wanted to put an end to the matter of their non-existent relationship. Just as the young man had dealt with a marquis, there was now again someone superfluous between them. At that moment, Sonia sat completely alone and waited for His Highness to finally be free. Theo entered with the words that he had already discussed everything with Sonia, and she dared to come back here again. The girl was very scared by the enraged young man, but made a polite bow and greeted him. He took Irene's hand, showed it to the girl, and asked if the church still didn't understand anything. It seemed Sonia really didn't understand what was being discussed, and why the young knight was so angry with her. Theo looked at her frowning, and said that he had recently explained everything to His Highness. He was still holding Irene's hand, and turned to Sonia with the words that their wedding would never take place, and that the girl should not waste time waiting for his reciprocal feelings. Theo said confidently that he already has a girlfriend, and for whom he is willing to do anything, and asked them never to stand in his way again, and never come to the palace again to seek a meeting with him. Sonia stood there clenching her fists, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Her eyes were full of emotion. She felt her heart squeezing with pain. She tried to keep her composure, but it was impossible to hide the anxiety that took hold of her. And a slight shiver ran through her body as she breathed deeply, trying to hold back the crying. In her opinion, the knight acts very ruthlessly and for some reason considers her a nuisance. Sonia asked if His Highness would allow the master to have relations with a servant girl. She thought she shouldn't worry, but it turned out that Tio had no intention of marrying the girl. And all this time, while she was hoping for a relationship and seeking a meeting, the prince was actually busy with someone else. Sonia looked at him with worried eyes and asked him to reconsider his relationship with the church. Was Tio not going to listen to a stranger trying to tell him what to do? He asked the girl to stop threatening him with the church and the failed relationship with her. The prince turned around and warned her that this was their last meeting and that the lady should better leave the palace. Sonia stood there clenching her fists, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. And Tio has no right to act like this. Moreover, she was his divine avatar who was personally designated by the church. And Tio has no right to act like this. Moreover, she was his divine avatar who was personally designated by the church. Tio said that the girl could use the title as much as she wanted and promised not to limit her powers regarding the church. Irene was worried about Sonia, who seemed very upset after a tense conversation with the knight. The prince and the maid walked towards the study door, and Tio once again informed Sonia that they would never marry. She considered the prince a wise man who had once saved her life, and she was sure otherwise their marriage could not fail. Tio squeezed Irene's hand tighter, who was unprepared for what was happening now. He apologized to the girl and told her that he had already explained everything to her and that the decision had been made a long time ago. Sonia started getting angry and didn't want to be rejected, especially in such a blatant way. Her face suddenly changed, and the girl confidently declared that the knight would regret what he had just done. They left the office, and Irene immediately asked if everything was all right with His Highness. Tio hugged the maid and told her that she had done a great job and that she was doing everything right despite the obstacles. Irene looked at the master with concern and confirmed that she was coping well with the difficulties. In fact, the maid was very worried that their union could lead to discord between the Imperial family and the church. The girl considered Tio's actions very serious and did not expect everything to happen so quickly. The young man reassured Irene that sooner or later, he would have to admit their relationship and take a responsible step. Tio hugged the maid and was willing to do anything to ensure she was happy with him and live in peace. The girl's eyes showed sincere intentions, and she was happy simply because the master loved her and respected her. He slowly leaned towards her, and their lips met in a tender kiss. At that moment, the whole world seemed to stop, as if eternity penetrated their hearts. He held her tightly, as if wanting to convey all his feelings without words. In his embrace, there was no room for pain and anxiety, only love and tenderness filling their hearts to the brim. In that moment, they forgot about everything in the world, because only in each other's arms did they find their true happiness. That night, lying in bed, Tio admitted once again that he would never marry Sonia, and that the girl didn't need to worry about it, and he even had a worthy contender for the avatar. That afternoon, Hales was sitting in his study and looking at the red rose that the maid had given him in the garden. For some reason, he couldn't find a place for himself and constantly thought about Irene, who seemed to melt his heart in an instant. Tio hugged Irene in bed and asked her if the girl was tired of his endless kisses. Now he had the right to ask her for a favor, said Tio. The girl should stop communicating with the Marquis. But being a maid, Irene could not refuse the Marquis, given her position and high status. Tio insisted that she find some kind of excuse, and Irene began to get nervous. He asked her for her own good to tell the Marquis that the knight was personally against their communication, so that he would stop bothering the girl. The prince no longer wanted to see them together, and watch how that bastard kept flirting with her. Irene didn't know the Marquis's motives for doing this, but she didn't want Tio to be nervous and worried. Besides, it can't be that the Marquis likes her and probably knows about her relationship with the prince. The next day, Irene decided to tell Hales everything and sat on a bench in the courtyard, hoping the young man would appear. She didn't have to wait long, and after a couple of minutes, the Marquis approached the maid and told her that it had been a wonderful day. The girl was prepared for the conversation and had decided everything, but still felt very nervous. Hollis suspected that Irene seemed to be acting strangely and tense in her interactions with him. He spoke, the girl was somehow different today and seemed to have been waiting specifically for him. That's why he also got a little nervous and decided not to hide his true emotions from her. The girl looked thoughtfully ahead and mentally prepared for an important conversation, for which the time was now the most appropriate. She gathered her courage and said that the Marquis was right and that she was indeed going to talk to him. Hollis looked at the maid with a kind gaze and said that his conjectures and feelings were completely justified. He suddenly smiled and asked if she could guess the topic of conversation between him and Irene. Hollis asked her if she liked him, but she admitted that she liked someone else. The Marquis looked at her with surprise and seemed not to expect such a frank confession. She admitted that she thought the young man wanted to see her, and that's why he was constantly seeking a meeting. Irene felt embarrassed for a moment, but she was completely sure that he was not attracted to her as a girl. And that was not the reason. Hollis looked at her and asked if she was attracted to him, she wouldn't be able to come there anymore. The girl was surprised by the words that she was truly beautiful, but he had no secret desire for her. Irene was one of the few people the Marquis interacted with, so he hoped the lady would enjoy his company. She stood up and said with good intentions that she was leaving, so that Prince Tio would not misunderstand him again. The maid thanked the young man for listening to her and correctly understanding the course of her thoughts. Holly seemed a little upset, and Irene was worried if he was okay. Now the maid was going to talk to His Highness, who had been a bit harsh lately, and she hoped that from now on his jealousy would pass. She knocked on the door and entered Theo's office to tell him about the conversation she had with the Marquis. Irene didn't immediately notice the prince, who was sitting silently in his chair, and did not answer her. The prince had apparently been very tired in recent days, so he was soundly asleep at his workplace. The girl noticed that the young man looked very tired and didn't even wake up when she appeared. Irene gently stroked the knight's hair and felt very pleased to look at the young man. She decided not to disturb the knight and give him some time to rest from his constant affairs. But the next moment, the girl jumped away from the boy, who suddenly woke up and spoke. He enjoyed the girl's touch and did not hide the pleasant sensations. He put his arm around the maid and said that he really liked it when she gently stroked his hair. In fact, he woke up as soon as she entered, but didn't want to open his eyes because he was very tired. And I just wanted to open my eyes and first see Irene's beautiful face next to me. She said that Theo should get even better after her words, which she came specifically to tell him. Irene smiled and proudly said that she had just told the Marquis that she had a loved one, and that he didn't need his company. Theo was very surprised when he found out that the Marquis didn't even insist and didn't try to convince the girl. It was evident that the prince was very happy with this news. He kissed the maid and told her very important words. The boy's heart beat so loudly that he was sure it was about to jump out of his chest. Theo stood in front of her, looking into her eyes, full of warmth and tenderness, breathing deeply. He finally found the courage to say what he had long wanted to confess his love for sweet Irene. He thought the Marquis had strong feelings for her, so he was jealous and aggressive towards him, but he was glad that the young man gave up so quickly. Basil stood outside the prince's office door with an important message and waited for Theo to allow him in. Theo was with Irene at that moment and shouted loudly that he was busy and had a guest. He looked at the maid and asked if she would like to hide somewhere for a moment. The prince joked and admitted that the girl shouldn't rush anywhere, that he himself would go out, and in the meantime she could calmly get ready. Irene heard the prince and planned to leave later after Theo dealt with Basil. She decided to sort the documents lying on the table for now so that there wouldn't be too much mess. Her attention was drawn to the strange pile of papers sticking out of the drawer, and Irene couldn't believe what she saw when she saw her face in the photograph attached to the papers. She picked up the papers, read the first page, and became very nervous about what she saw. All the pages contained information about her and her life before working at the Imperial Palace. There was much more information there than in the documents she had specifically prepared for her job, and it was her complete autobiography. Irene wanted to know what these documents were and started looking for the ones she had submitted. The girl couldn't believe that the knight had actually found out all the information about her past, but she didn't know why he was doing this and treated her with suspicion for some reason. The maid stayed in Theo's office until late at night, trying to figure out what she had done. Even what she said about her family was recorded with great detail and meticulousness. Irene accidentally glanced at her watch and got scared. The prince was about to return, and she should leave quickly. But she had to put everything back in place and try to make sure no one noticed her presence. But the girl couldn't pretend that she hadn't seen or known anything, so she was going to tell Theo everything. After this, the maid felt tired and didn't even notice one of the maids calling her. Irene looked back, but suddenly dropped the can of lemonade, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. The maid came to help her and asked where her attention and good mood had gone. The girl made many mistakes at work today, and the maid began to worry if everything was all right with Irene. It turned out that Irene had previously submitted the documents incorrectly, which was unusual for her, as she always treated work assignments with care and responsibility. She was on the verge of tears, but admitted that she was really doing a bad job, and that she just needed to fix things first. Irene was not willing to endure this and live in ignorance, so she went straight to the prince. She handed him some papers with her photograph and said that yesterday she had found some strange papers about her. Theo didn't understand what she meant and asked to see the documents the maid had brought. From the first second, it was clear that those papers were familiar to him, and he perfectly understood what was written in them. He looked at the maid and asked her where she had found those papers, but Irene understood that he himself must know the place where they were stored, and now he was asking strange questions. The young woman affirmed that these were definitely not the documents she submitted when applying for the job, and she was very worried because the master, without her knowledge, decided to collect data about the maid's life. She was stunned that Theo could treat her with suspicion and not believe her words. The prince replied angrily. She had misunderstood everything, and he had no intention of compiling a complete biography about her due to mistrust. He admitted that he was indeed looking for information about her and her past life, but he did it not because he suddenly wanted to, but for completely different important reasons. Theo said that Vols began to treat her very strangely after the incident, when she could easily translate an ancient language, although she had never learned it. After that, he began to stare intently at Irene and suspect something, which greatly surprised the girl. Theo tried to explain that due to her disobedience regarding the wedding, the church was against him. He was sure that everyone was trying to control and confuse him in his behavior and communication. Irene assumed they believed the girl had been sent from the temple and was telling them what to do. But she didn't understand one thing: why Theo kept blaming Basil for everything. After all, he was his assistant, and the prince himself had personally allowed him to think that way about the maid. Irene started crying and shouted loudly. Theo himself gave the orders and suspected that she was the right decision. The prince insisted that he never doubted her and believed in her, but this was a forced measure. But he couldn't give any details until he verified the facts himself, and he was only trying to convince the stubborn Vols. It was painful for the maid to hear such words from the master. She said that she only wanted to help him, and that she did everything only out of great love and respect for him, and that there were never any bad intentions in her actions. She turned away and whispered that she was not a temple scout, but that didn't matter anymore. Theo fell silent, and the words that had seemed so light before and warm now stuck in his throat, finding no way out. A silence lurked between them, deeper and darker than any night darkness, and in that silence sounded a heavy and unpleasant decision. The prince could not contain his emotions. His eyes reflected a pain, indescribable and immense, like an ocean of sorrow flooding his soul, and every beat of it echoed in his chest, like a heavy burden he couldn't shake off. He felt pieces of his heart crumble, leaving only emptiness and shattered dreams. And everything he believed in, everything he fought for, was disappearing like grains of sand in the desert, crumbling between his fingers. Theo felt he would soon go mad and only saw one correct decision: to confess everything to Irene. It was a beautiful warm day outside, and Irene was sitting by the window, lost in her thoughts about how Theo could blame his assistant instead of himself, and not be completely honest with her. She screamed in surprise when she heard a man's voice behind her, calling the head maid. It was Raoul. He said the chamberlain was looking for Irene and wanted to meet with her soon. The chamberlain informed the maid that he had no time to explain, but that starting tomorrow, she would be working for someone else. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and the man asked her if perhaps she had changed her mind. But recently, she had shown a great desire to change jobs as soon as possible. Recently, she had personally approached the man and asked him to transfer her to another position. Irene had strongly desired this before, but now she had completely forgotten that the other day she had asked the chamberlain for help. He said that a position as a servant to His Highness Evan would soon be available, and the lady could try to get a job there, especially since she had a lot of experience and could start work immediately. Recently, she thought the prince was going to marry the divine avatar and believed such a thing could really happen. But this turned out to be just a misunderstanding, and now she is disappointed with Her Highness's behavior and is deeply sad. Irene looked down and said she agreed with the decision to move to a new master. He asked again if the maid regretted her decision and put a seal on the envelope containing the transfer request. After some time, Theo couldn't find a place for himself because Irene hadn't visited him for a long time after the fight. Usually she brought documents at this time, but today she didn't come at the appointed time. He was angry with Basil yesterday, but that didn't solve any of his problems. A knock was heard at the door, and the prince held his breath, hoping it was Irene who had arrived with the documents that needed to be signed. But it was Raoul, with a stack of documents, who from that day on was appointed the master's assistant. Theo stood up and shouted, why had he come there? And where was his personal maid Irene, who was supposed to carry out these tasks? Raoul reported that she was transferred to work in another place today, and the girl no longer works for the Lord. For a moment, Theo was speechless, and for a few more minutes he silently looked at the servant who had delivered the news. He said that Irene had been allowed to change jobs, so from today she had chosen to serve Prince Evan. Theo wanted to run to look for the maid, but Raoul stopped him and told him that she herself asked him to take care of the prince, and she herself expressed her desire to leave. Moreover, the prince has an important meeting in 10 minutes, and there is very little time left to prepare. The prince was going to find out why Irene suddenly decided to change jobs, and didn't tell him anything. Raoul didn't know the reason, but the maid handed over all the tasks and looked very sad. Theo thought for a moment and wondered if he had really hurt the girl so much that she had resorted to such extreme measures. For some reason, she didn't tell him her decision, and Theo didn't know if he should wait for her to tell him herself. He had never encountered anything like this before, and now he simply didn't know what to do. So he ordered all meetings to be cancelled for now. Prince Evan asked his maid to hand him the documents she left after yesterday's meeting. Irene didn't immediately respond to the request and seemed very lost, something that had never happened to her before. She responded to the prince and tried her best not to show her sad mood. And thoughtful, the maid always knew where everything was, but this time she couldn't even remember where she had recently put the documents. She apologized and found the necessary papers, and the prince realized that something strange was clearly happening to her. He said he was very happy to see Irene again among his servants, who always did an excellent job. Evan supposed that the idiot Theo was probably bothering the girl a lot, and it was good that she didn't decide to leave him completely, because he would be very sorry to lose such a valuable and worthy employee. In fact, he was interested in what was happening between the maid and the prince, because then the latter seemed very rebellious, and he asked for Irene to be brought to him. And now she returned from him in a very bad mood, but Evan was still very happy, and Irene would help him again. This was their first meeting, and Theo, who never seemed greedy, suddenly jealously wanted to take that man with him. It was obvious to Evan that he liked her as a girl, but what was happening between them remained a mystery to him. He had sent her away on purpose, hoping they would get along, and now he felt guilty because part of the responsibility lay with him. Evan said that the maid hadn't worked for him for 4 months and probably wanted to rest. Judging by the girl's mood, His Highness Evan was not demanding, and it was wonderful to see him again. Otherwise, the girl might have had trouble, but Irene still couldn't pull herself together and come to her senses that she didn't even realize how she ran into the marquis in the garden. She immediately admitted that this time, their meeting was truly just a coincidence. Irene laughed because she didn't even have time to say anything, but apparently the young man saw her fear and decided to clear up all misunderstandings at once. He asked the girl what she was doing in the garden, and she said she was heading to see His Highness. He was surprised to learn that the maid no longer worked for Prince Theo, but was Evan's personal servant. Suddenly, in the distance, she saw Prince Theo, who was walking confidently with Lady Monette on some business. Irene grabbed the Marquis's hand and hurried to hide behind the first nearby column before the master saw her. A whole week had passed since they last saw each other, and the prince seemed to be perfectly fine without her. Hollis asked why they were hiding, and Irene looked at him with frightened eyes. She tried to joke that the sun was shining brightly, but she observed the night carefully. She perfectly understood that she wouldn't be able to run away from him like this every time, and that someday they would have to talk. Hollis asked the maid to spare him some time, and said he wanted to invite the lady to an interesting place. Inhaling the fresh aroma of blooming roses and jasmine, the maid found herself in a magical corner, a flourishing garden where every flower seemed to play its own melody of life. Her steps were light, like a dance over the rose petals melting beneath her. Leaving traces of her delicate scent, and closing her eyes, she immersed herself in the world of nature, listening to the rustle of the leaves and the singing of the birds, which seemed to tell her about the greatness of this place. The maid felt her soul filled with peace and tranquility, as if every flower in that garden brought her a piece of its invisible power. Harmony sounded in her heart, penetrating every cell of her being, and with each breath she absorbed the energy of the garden. And filled with its strength and life inspiration, she admitted that she had never entered the garden so deeply, because servants were not allowed to be there without permission. He was glad the girl liked the garden and asked her to tell him what happened between her and Theo. Hollis was aware of their relationship, and Irene was stunned to hear that her connection with the master was not a secret to everyone. Irene got nervous, and the Marquis immediately promised her that he wouldn't tell anyone. And not to worry. She said that she and Theo met several years ago, and that was the day they met. It was about 3 years ago, when she was sitting on a bench after a banquet that didn't involve working barefoot. Hallies found this strange, because 3 years ago the knight was still at war, and could not have met her. Irene said they met before Theo went to war, and most likely he didn't even remember the incident. Their next meeting took place when the crown prince returned from treatment, and she was very surprised to see him. Irene spoke about their first meeting with great inspiration, and remembered how her heart almost jumped out of her chest that day. Hollis thought that the prince's divine avatar supposedly had been blessed. Theo was in the temple due to an injury, but it turned out that Irene had met the prince before Sonia. He didn't want to admit it, but from the moment they met, everything around her spoke, and pointed to the fact that she was a true divine avatar. And only thanks to the meeting with Irene on the bench, Theo was able to survive the bloody battle. Was the church really so sure that her true avatar would not reveal herself? In any case, everything boiled down to the fact that they wanted to get rid of him in any manifestation of the divine avatar. Hollis thought about what would happen if he told the royal family everything. At first, he tried to use Irene, opening everyone's eyes to the fact that she was the real divine avatar. And then he could increase his family's influence. But now, a bunch of doubts related to the maid overwhelmed him, and the young man didn't understand at all what to do. And all only because he liked her, and the young man only recently realized this. But there was no guarantee that Irene would become a mere pawn in political games when he revealed the secret of her divine manifestation. And if she got into trouble because of the temple's machinations, in any case, Hales first needed to know all the weak points of the church. He suddenly told the girl that she was a very special person, and now all words were superfluous. In his hands was a bouquet that Irene had picked in the garden, and the Marquis told her to make sure to take them with her. He thanked the maid for the walk, and told her she had to hurry on an important matter. The last time the lady was a little rude to the Marquis, but he understood everything. And today, he took her to such a beautiful place. Irene was told that a letter had arrived from home, but she hadn't received letters for a long time. And the mail wasn't supposed to arrive until the end of the month, and probably something might have happened at home. Monette brought the prince some important papers that needed urgent signing. He asked again what she should do, and promised to listen carefully to Monet this time. Theo took a sip of tea and banged the cup on the table, shouting that Raoul didn't even know how to make tea properly. Monet asked him not to scold the servant, who was as busy with his business as the prince. Monet asked if he felt sorry for Basil, whom he hadn't allowed into his office for several days. But Theo simply answered mysteriously that he would have thrown him out of the palace, and that he was putting papers in the wrong place. The girl asked if the prince would like to speak to him personally before punishing him. If he could have done otherwise, he would have, and he thought that Irene herself had asked for a transfer to another post, and she decided to distance herself from him. Theo wanted to talk to her the whole time, but he was afraid that it could only get worse. And now, he sadly admitted that Irene no longer belonged to him, and from that moment on everything was over. Monet smiled and said that she was always surprised how the master fought bravely on the battlefield, but knew absolutely nothing about relationships. Theo asked if he had asked Basil his opinion on the maid, and about her divine manifestation, and about how ordinary Irene looked like a divine avatar. Monet said that she had been very busy lately, so she completely forgot to tell him. She promised to do everything immediately, and a couple of minutes later, an enraged Basil burst into the office. Stunned by the news, Theo said that the maid had shown signs of divine manifestation. Lady Monet had noticed it and was completely sure of the authenticity of what she had seen. This meant that the simple servant Irene was probably blessed by the heavens themselves. Basil supposed that he could be an avatar, and now it became clear why he was able to quickly read the ancient language. And the veracity of her version could only be verified at a ceremony in the church. And if everything was indeed so, a mark would appear on her body. But it was not clear what would happen to the divine avatar assigned by the church. None of those present knew if there was any trace of divine manifestation on Sonia's body. Basil heard that the church held a private ceremony, and it was as if a mark appeared on the avatar's body. But they don't know if this is true. It was strange. The celebration the temple wanted to hold was held in secret, and the Marquis actually turned out to be an observant guy. Theo got up from the table and shouted loudly to immediately find Irene and bring her there so they could finally explain everything to her. Until that moment, Theo was not interested in what the temple was doing, but if it concerned Irene, everything would be different. Theo rushed to accompany him to the maid's rooms, but there was no one in the room, and there was only a letter on the table. The prince received unexpected news. The maid had recently resigned and no longer worked in the Imperial palace, and Theo couldn't believe that Irene had gotten up and left him without explaining anything. Not long before, Irene had spoken with Evan, who wanted to know why the maid had decided to resign. It was obvious that it was difficult for the girl to name the true reason, and she thought for a long time before answering. Irene has younger brothers and sisters. Her mother suffers from a chronic illness, and she recently found out that her illness has worsened. He asked why, in that case, the lady couldn't just take a few days off instead of resigning. Irene worried. She didn't know when she could return and continue working, and Evan promised to prepare a carriage so she could return home. Irene held a black handkerchief in her hands and cried, because she had never told His Highness about her departure. She approached the door of her beloved home and soon saw the family she hadn't seen for a long time. She was greeted by a young woman named Belle, who seemed not to immediately understand who was in front of her. Irene smiled sweetly and said it had been a long time since they had seen each other and called the girl her sister. Sun rays penetrated through the leaves of the trees, illuminating the path where the two sisters, separated for a long time, met again, and their hearts beat stronger than ever, filling the air with warmth and joy. The sisters hugged each other as if they were never going to separate, and tears of happiness ran down their cheeks, washing them with waves of joy and gratitude. 3 boys appeared at the door, looking at their little sister with surprise, and not believing that she had really returned. They ran to Irene and happily hugged as she marveled at how quickly they had grown in that time. Brother Dave became very tall, and little Katie now had longer hair. The sister shared the news. Mother began to take even more medication, but there was no improvement. The doctor who was treating Molly said that the pills no longer helped the woman. Irene was sure that there had to be another way or treatment that could help. That afternoon, a strong downpour fell on the streets like the wrath of nature, pouring between the buildings and flooding the asphalt with its jets. As raindrops drummed on the roofs of the houses, Molly left some medicine, and the girl was sure it would be enough for the next few days. But suddenly at night, the worried voice of the sister was heard, urgently looking for Irene. Her mother lay in bed groaning loudly from intense pain that did not subside for a second. Everything was fine before, but now the woman was tormented by a severe cough that didn't even let her breathe. It turned out that the medicine ran out quickly because the mother started having a strong coughing fit. Irene didn't have time to think. She went to the door of the house and announced that she was going to get medicine. The sister tried to stop her by saying it could be dangerous, and the doctor had left a few days ago. But Irene quickly put on her outerwear and said she would try to get medicine elsewhere, and ordered them to take care of her mother for now. Since there was no doctor, the girl had no choice but to ask the Viscount in the palace for help. 2 young men guarding the palace entrance stood in the heavy rain near the gate. One of the young men was indignant to see how this capital guest managed to get there in such bad weather. Irene approached the gate, took off her hood, and said loudly, she used to work here as a maid. She asked if she could speak to the butler, but the guards forbade the girl from entering. Large raindrops streamed down Irene's wet hair as she excitedly shouted to the guards to tell the butler her name. But the young men insisted that the passage was closed and the girl shouldn't be there. Irene pleaded the matter was urgent, and she needed help that only the Imperial family could provide. Suddenly, Lady Monette came to her aid and pushed one of the guards away from the girl. She saw that Irene was soaked from the rain and was in a very confused state. The prince's assistant looked at the maid and kindly asked her to come inside with him to warm up. And if the assistant was here, it meant that Prince Tio was also in the palace now. The butler asked why the girl had come alone late at night, and Irene said she came for medicine. She lowered her head and modestly whispered if the doctor had any medication for her mother. Theo seemed to have a premonition that Irene would come here, and it wasn't in vain that he had traveled a long way to the palace. He looked at Irene, who was crying from grief and helplessness, and wanted to say important words to her. She looked at the knight and quietly said again that she came here for medicine. The girl cried bitterly and said her mother felt very ill at the moment, and that there was no time to talk. Theo saw that the girl was very worried and needed his support and help, which he was always ready to provide. One of the servants was ordered to urgently bring the medicine, and the man ran to fetch it. A few minutes later, he brought a tray with several bottles and asked what exactly the girl needed. Irene didn't know the name of the medicine and said her mother had a lot of cough and fever. Theo asked his assistant to urgently select a medicine for certain symptoms and bring it to him. He stood in front of the girl and asked her to wait a little so that she could calm down a bit. He took her hand and told her that he would take her home, but the girl didn't want to cause any trouble for the night. Theo said that he intended to ask Irene many questions, but all matters could wait a little. And now he had to take care of her mother. The prince placed his hand on hers, as if giving her a piece of his own strength. Irene smiled, feeling how his words penetrated her heart, warming it with tender hope. She realized she wasn't alone, and next to her was someone willing to support her in the most difficult moment. And she thanked him for the support that made her heart stronger. Theo said that the woman could be in critical condition, and offered his hand to Irene while she was in the torrential rain. She firmly held the medicine bottle in her hands and offered her hand to Theo, who was the best rider in the palace. They jumped on the horse. The prince asked her to relax, lean on him, and show him the way home. Irene tried to hold on tighter, and at that moment, she felt the breath of the master she had missed for so long. They arrived quickly at Irene's house, and the rainstorm had just ended. Theo gently helped the girl down, and the moment their gazes crossed after a long separation, he felt that this fragile lady was very dear to his heart. They looked into each other's eyes for a while and couldn't break away, but shouts were heard from the maid's house. It was a child's cry, Irene realized. Her little brother had woken up, and the prince asked her to go in quickly. The girl looked happily at the knight, clutching the precious medicine bottle tighter. She entered the house and saw the excited children and her sister, whose eyes expressed fear and horror. Irene said she brought medicine and asked how the mother felt and if she had gotten worse. Fortunately, during this time the cough subsided, but the woman was now unconscious. The girl gave the medicine to her mother and believed that in a moment she would feel better and would definitely recover. She understood that it was all thanks to the prince, and the first thing she did was go thank him for his help. The girl walked slowly towards Tio, who had helped her a lot, and her heart beat faster than usual because she was very happy and grateful. But the prince was the first to confess. He realized that he loved the girl much more than he could imagine. Irene threw herself into the boy's arms with such passionate tenderness that he felt his heart beating in unison with hers. She wrapped her arms around him, pressed closer to him, as if afraid to let go. Their embrace was full of passion, love, and tenderness, like two halves that had finally found each other. And at that moment, nothing else mattered except themselves. She pressed against his dear shoulder and whispered how much she had missed him all this time. Her heart beat loudly, and she felt joy take over her soul. Every moment without him seemed infinitely long. Every breath reminded him of her scent. Every sound reminded him of her voice. It was so hard for him to experience this separation, and he understood that Irene was special to him, and his life was filled with bright colors only by her side. He decided to ask why the girl resigned and did not talk to him about her decision. But Irene looked at the prince with surprise and said that she had not resigned from the Imperial palace. She wrote a statement and was about to submit it, but Prince Evan gave her a day off, and the girl happily accepted his offer. The girl was going to take care of all the household matters and then return to work. And it turned out that her brother lied to her. He admitted that he thought she resigned because she was very angry with him after their last meeting. But the girl just wanted to distance herself to think things over and make the right decision. Theo apologized for not stopping Basil's investigation, but it hadn't started out of any suspicion. And the prince knew that the maid was not a spy. He said that he would understand her anyway if the girl was disappointed or angry. Theo stood in front of her with sad and sincere eyes and sincerely asked her forgiveness for everything he had done by mistake. Apologizing may not be easy, and Irene thought it would be difficult for the prince to do so because he was one of the important people in the empire. But this responsible step showed her a different side, and Irene gently pressed her lips against his. A few days later, the prince sent a doctor to Irene's family to examine her mother. She had been unconscious the whole time since Irene brought the medicine that terrible night. However, the doctor came out of the mother's room with a sad face and gave her bad news. A few days later, Irene's entire family stood before the tombstone with her mother's name inscribed on it. Theo sent her a letter, promised to be there soon, and suggested meeting at the home of Viscount Easton. Her body shuddered with heavy sobs. Every breath was a blow that tore at her heart. As if yesterday she saw her mother, smiling and surrounded by a warmth emanating from her, like a sunbeam breaking through the clouds. Now death had taken her away, leaving behind emptiness and pain, and tears streamed down the girl's cheeks, mixing with her hair, which was already quite carelessly tangled due to her grief. She threw herself into Theo's arms, asking him why he had only just arrived now and hadn't been at the funeral. The prince apologized for leaving the girl alone and promised never to abandon her again. The next day, Theo lay next to Irene, who still couldn't stop crying bitterly. The girl said she was grateful that the prince had taken care of her since their first meeting. And Theo smiled as he remembered how that day the maid had stood and smelled his shirt in his office. But the maid smiled and said they had met much earlier, and the master was very surprised at that moment. Irene said they met for the first time before he went to war, when Theo wrapped a handkerchief around his wounded leg, and after that they met in the garden. On a bench where she was sitting, Theo took her by the shoulders and asked if it was really Irene who was in front of him that day, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He remembered that the wound was serious, so he used his handkerchief to bandage his leg. And so he first met Irene, and his relationship with Sonia happened much later. He asked her if she remembered the day they were at the temple for the queen's farewell ceremony. That day, Moneta saw something strange, and that's when Theo saw a strange light during the ceremony. It appeared on Irene, and this meant only one thing: a divine manifestation lives in the girl. She laughed and didn't believe his words, but Theo insisted that all this really happened. Now he understood that the master had survived the war only thanks to his encounter with his divine avatar. After returning to the palace, he knew he had met Irene, but he wasn't sure if it was her back then. But now he is absolutely sure that the girl was his true avatar. Theo looked at the girl and said they would urgently go to the capital with her brothers and sisters to finally discover the whole truth. Irene didn't understand what was happening because she was just a common maid and ordinary who was very confused in her life. Irene's brothers and sisters looked with surprise at the new place where they would live now. The girl looked at the house with admiration and quickly wanted to thank the prince for preparing such a nice home for them. Monette said that this house wasn't the best and that they would have to be patient for a while. But the maid was happy and said this house was beautiful. He said they would have to go to the temple, where Prince Theo was already waiting for her for the ceremony. He saw a cute girl and asked if the long journey had tired her, but Irene was fine. The heroine asked if all the temple ministers knew everything and who else would be present at the ceremony. But it turned out to be a closed part of the temple that no one else could enter. Basil apologized to the lady for causing her trouble, and the priest approached Theo. He was a man named Chent. He bowed, greeted the master, and was ready to perform the ceremony. This priest was Basil's father, and he was the one who was supposed to perform today's important ceremony. The man couldn't believe that the high priest whom he followed and trusted turned out to be a liar. Everything was already ready for the ceremony. Those present headed to the temple and were about to start immediately. They entered the hall, and the priest asked Irene to stand in the center of the circle drawn on the floor. He announced the beginning of the ceremony and asked everyone present to be silent. Chen said that if the lady felt well and ready to start, she could come to the center of the circle. He looked at the girl and said he was very worried about the ceremony taking place. According to His Highness, Irene was a true divine avatar, and they had to trick the church to get here. The man was also scared, but everyone had to discover the truth that had been hidden for a long time together. The priest put his hands together, closed his eyes, and began reciting a prayer while Irene slowly walked towards the circle. The light filling the room was so bright that everyone had to close their eyes for a moment. The girl stood in the center of the circle, illuminated by a magical glow emanating directly from her. Tio looked and couldn't believe what was happening. It could be that the assistant had seen the same thing that time. A couple of minutes later, Irene fell to the floor from the sudden weakness she felt in her whole body. The prince hurried to lift the girl in his arms, but accidentally saw a strange mark on her leg. He was sure that this inscription hadn't been there before, and definitely appeared now during the ceremony. The priest looked at her leg and said that now everything was clear to him, and before his eyes, a divine seal appeared on the girl's leg. This meant that Irene was indeed a divine avatar, but the emperor trusted the temple very much. And if Tio was now permanently linked to Irene, then they had falsified the results of the revelation. Everyone present bowed to Irene, but Tio asked the priests to stand up. He said he understood that they were only following the orders of the chief priest, and that he wouldn't blame them, especially since one of them is Basil's father. And besides, they helped carry out the revelation ceremony for Irene. The prince warned that he would keep his word, but now the priests might lose their jobs. After the ceremony, Tio and Irene walked with Evan, and the prince was going to tell his brother the whole truth. He said that he and the girl had just returned from the temple, and that the divine avatar designated by the church was not real. The true divine avatar is right in front of him, and it is his common maid, and ordinary Irene's. Evan was surprised and immediately asked why they were so sure, and if there was any evidence. The maid lifted the hem of her dress and showed her leg, on which the divine seal had been adorned since that day. She said that it was the divine seal of the avatar that appeared on her after the ceremony in the temple. Tio said that he knew that the revelation could happen after a special ceremony, which is why he brought the girl to the temple, and according to the priest who performed the ceremony, the inscription was in divine language. The church's fake ceremony was secret. The chief priest was not there, and only then did he declare that the revelation had taken place. But this girl never showed signs of being Tio's divine avatar. Evan listened to his brother, considered it all complete madness, and asked who else knew that Irene had a revelation. Irene wasn't sure, but said that perhaps only the Marquis of Tilford might still know. It turned out that Hales had been trying to hint to the prince for a long time, and at one point started bringing reports on how the temple administers donations. And it turned out that some of the temple's projects, where the money was sent, were not real, and it seems that the funds were stolen, but there is not enough exact evidence of this. Evan had already tried to get more detailed information, but he knew it was unlikely they would catch the Theology Support Fund red-handed. He asked if he really should address the girl as a divine avatar now. The girl said she was still Irene and still worked as a maid in the Imperial Palace. She still couldn't realize that she had become a divine avatar. Besides, the girl returned to work. The maids welcomed her and were very worried about her all this time, happy that she had returned in full health. Until that moment, the girl was scared, but now she had close friends by her side. So everything was fine, and most importantly, there was proof that she was the prince's true avatar. Before this, Irene prayed a lot, and often, even when she wasn't a palace maid yet. And even after being hired, she continued to pray and thank the Almighty. When she met the prince, she often prayed for him to return alive from the war. And her words must have been heard, then through a revelation. Prince Tio entered through the door, very happy to see Irene back in the Imperial Palace. He asked her if she had shown this sign to anyone, took off a bandage, and said he would bandage it for a short time so no one else could see it. Irene was curious why the divine seal appeared on her leg and not somewhere else, and she supposed that perhaps this happened because the ankle was the first place the knight touched in their first meeting. The maid beamed with happiness as she told him about their encounter and the appearance of the divine sign. Tio said he tried to forget that day because it brought him many bad memories, and he lost a bet with his brother. Irene could feel that the young man was worried because he didn't remember the day of their first meeting. And now he seemed so scared. He hugged the girl tightly, and now Irene knew what kind of person he really was, what he felt and what he experienced. She pressed her face against him and understood that Tio did everything only for her and never deceived her. The girl felt ashamed and said that she was still not used to being in her new position as a divine avatar. Theo understood that the girl might be scared due to the unknown future that lay ahead. She admitted that this disturbed her and affected her a little, and the prince tenderly kissed Irene on the cheek and told her that everything would be fine now. Shortly after, His Highness received unexpected news and became furious. In front of him was Sonia, who wanted to come in person and tell him everything about Theo in detail. The prince took Irene's hand and asked if she was ready to go with him and tell everyone the truth. His Highness, the prince, and Irene entered the hall where the emperor were, his subjects and the young Sonia. The father asked Theo for what reasons he had rejected Sonia again, and the prince confidently declared that the maid now standing beside him was his true beloved. The father was indignant because the prince rejected the divine avatar for the sake of a simple maid. But Theo shouted that this girl was his true avatar. His entire life he couldn't do anything of his own free will, but only obeyed his father's will. And he didn't even have the opportunity to independently choose a loved one. Suddenly, Evan intervened in the conversation and loudly declared that the emperor didn't know much. He brought documents confirming the fact of corruption and treason in the temple. Not long before this, a young man approached Evan and told him the whole truth, but he wanted to stay away and gave the prince papers that, according to him, were supposedly going to help reveal the whole truth. It contained all the information he could gather about the temple's finances, and Evan realized that it could seriously undermine the temple's position. It turns out that Hollis already knew about Irene, and he provided these documents not to make a good impression on the future emperor. He handed the documents to the prince and told him that he had done everything possible to reveal the truth, and asked to protect in every way possible this beautiful and kind girl who had experienced so many events. Evan loudly stated that some of the church's projects were fictitious, and that one of those projects was Lady Sonia Dale. The father insisted that funds were also allocated to help the divine avatar, and that was the temple's doing, but Theo interrupted him. Sonia was never a divine avatar. The emperor rose from his throne and, unable to contain his anger, shouted that his son dared not insult him. Sonia intervened in the dialogue and angrily stated that the prince dared to insult the temple with his actions. The lady was very angry and stated that the revelation that reached her had been announced in the church, and that they had no right to go against it. Theo asked Irene to unwrap the bandage on her leg and show everyone the sign, which was a true divine seal. The prince said that the seal appeared after the ceremony and is proof that Irene is the true divine avatar, and Sonia is just an imposter. Theo loudly declared that he was absolutely sure that the maid was his true avatar. Evan suggested that if his father still had doubts, he should let Lady Sonia provide her testimony. But the girl was just a false incarnation and couldn't do this. The temple tried for a long time to achieve a high position and even dared to invade the powers of the Imperial family. They used what happened to Theo and replaced the real avatar with a fake one. He looked at Sonia, who was on the side, and tearfully said she just loved the master. His Highness turned to the maid and politely asked the girl's name again. He admitted that he didn't really know what was going on and that he had acted rather stupidly towards her. The emperor knelt down, looked at the maid, and asked her to forgive him for his reckless actions. He promised to punish with all cruelty the temple that kept silent about the identity of the true divine avatar. Irene smiled and asked the man who was her beloved young man's father to stand up. At that moment, Princess Lauren ran into the hallway shouting that she knew everything, and she couldn't believe it. She hugged the girl and was very happy to know that all the news was true, and that the maid was an authentic avatar. Evan thought about it and made a decision. From that day, they declare war on the temple, and no other options are accepted. The prince announced that Irene would no longer work as a maid, and the girl didn't expect to hear that at all. He asked the butler to bring her what she asked for. It was a special key that gave the girl the status of an honored guest. Evan could not allow the divine avatar to live in a miserable house, so the 2-room apartment with her family would now live in the palace. Before that, Irene didn't know what it meant to receive a key, but now she was looked after by servants who were her friends and shared their joys and sorrows. An order was given that the lady should change clothes immediately, and after a while, Irene stood in a luxurious dress and couldn't believe this was really happening to her now. She felt awkward when Ebra helped her and tried to convince her that she didn't need help and that she could do everything herself. But the maid replied that she had to follow the emperor's order, who had entrusted her care to her, and it was a great honor for her to help her best friend find happiness. Since that ceremony, everything has changed drastically in the life of Irene, who until recently was a simple maid. Tio warned the girl they are starting a fight with the temple. The false avatar has already been arrested. The news of this will soon reach the temple, so the chief priest will try to harm her. And as a member of the emperor, he is obliged to protect the divine avatar. So he warned the lady about all the troubles that may happen in the fight for justice. And the truth, he tried to support Irene, although he knew that things would not be so easy, but they had no other choice. She was worried that His Highness would be very disappointed, because the truth had come to light, and that relations with the temple would be ruined. But she really hoped that everything would turn out well, and that together, they could face all the problems. Theo mounted his horse and promised the girl that everything would definitely turn out well for them, and set off on his journey. After the prince left, Irene immediately began to pray for Theo to return safe and sound and hoped that once everything was over, they would definitely be together. Rumors spread quickly throughout the temple, and one of the priests, who did not expect the appearance of the divine avatar, understood that the temple would soon collapse. So he quickly tried to collect all the gold to escape and save himself. But Lady Monette was warned and saw how the priest was about to escape and avoid punishment. He was immediately captured by the knights, and they informed him that they had received an order to escort the priest to the Imperial palace. He tried to threaten everyone with celestial punishment, but Tio, who had been waiting for this moment for so long, entered through the door. The prince placed a sword to the priest's throat and said that he had committed a crime by moving away from God's will and trying to use the fate of his master to achieve his own goals. Tio had no intention of feeling sorry for those who were completely guilty, and muttered that the man would pay for everything he had done. Irene ran out of the palace with eyes full of joy and excitement in her beautiful dress. She tightly hugged the prince, who had just returned, and felt how much she had missed him. He had been absent for only a few days, but the girl greeted him with more joy than he expected. He congratulated her on her beautiful dress, and the lady felt ashamed, extremely awkward. Suddenly, everyone started addressing her as lady, and Irene asked the master to revoke his decree. Tio said that he would no longer allow her to be treated as a maid, and it would never be like that again. Then he pretended not to hear this request and tenderly kissed his beloved girl. After Irene became the divine avatar, all the maids started treating her differently, and it seemed incredible to them that an avatar was among them. The prince asked the lady not to worry any more about being noticed, and thought it would be nice to meet there. Irene took his hand and gently asked if the knight would like to go to the bedroom with her. Tio smiled and said that the girl was mocking him again, and he was fascinated by the young woman's words. He lifted her in his arms and warned her that she couldn't break free, and that all she could do was resign herself. They were left alone in the room, under the sunset, when the last rays of the sun broke through the curtains. Irene and Tio lay on the bed, immersed in silence and peace, and could barely believe that after incredibly stressful events, they finally found a moment for themselves. Tio said that very soon she could forget about the maid costume forever and never work as a servant again. He announced that the next day there would be a dinner, and Irene was surprised, as it hadn't been planned in advance. It turned out that the dinner would be specially prepared to present Irene to high society in her new role. Irene began to worry because she was not mentally prepared for such an event. But Tio hugged her and told her that as long as she was near, she shouldn't worry about anything. He said that tomorrow she should be attended by a person who would come to pick her up around the same time. Princess Lauren burst into the girls' room the next morning and loudly announced that it was time to get ready for the event. There wasn't much time to get ready, and all the servants were hovering around Irene since early morning. Irene wore a luxurious dress, and her presence was shrouded in an atmosphere of sophistication and elegance. The exquisite curves of the dress framed her figure, giving her grace and sophistication, and the color of the dress emphasized her natural beauty and gave her nobility and sophistication. Holding her breath, the young man saw his beloved in a beautiful dress, and at that moment, when their eyes met her image, time seemed to stand still. He couldn't take his eyes off her graceful figure, which the dress emphasized with incredible grace. When he approached her, he couldn't help but praise her and tell her how beautiful she was, how well the dress suited her, and how incredible she looked in it, and his words were full of sincerity and love. He offered his hand to the girl and said that it was time to present their true divine avatar to everyone. His Highness the Emperor arrived for a gala dinner with Princess Lauren and Prince Evan. The prince and Irene walked through the hall. Their presence attracted the attention of all the guests. They looked like a perfect couple, combining grace and nobility. The prince radiated confidence and strength, provoking admiration in everyone who saw him. And in his eyes, one could see the tenderness and love he felt for his beloved. Before the dinner began, the emperor was about to make an important declaration and said that a temple submitted to a deity must be submitted to him in everything. He said that the temple had deceived the empire by presenting a false divine avatar, and they had managed to deceive him and the entire family. They had thrown dust in the eyes of the imperial family, acting on their own motives, calling the entire incident a terrible crime. The guests were shocked by what they heard, and the emperor promised to fix the situation and punish all those responsible. He informed those present that there was now a true divine avatar in that hall, and that they were ready to present him. The truth of this incarnation was proven in the ceremony of revelation, and there is proof of it in the presence of a special seal on the girl. Several days had passed since Irene's confession, and that night the girl was walking down a dark prison corridor. From all the cells, people reached out their hands to her and asked for forgiveness for the crimes they had committed. But she came here to see a certain person who had recently been imprisoned. Sonia looked at the girl and said she had no idea that Irene was actually a messenger of the Almighty. But now she is standing in front of her and looking at her as if she were a nobody punished for a crime. Irene said that what she really wants is to let the girl out of that terrible place. She admitted that she doesn't consider her a villain and simply wants to help Sonia, who cursed her for appearing in the master's life. Sonia said she always envied the maid, and every time her heart broke into 1,000 pieces, because the prince truly loved her very much, even though she wasn't his divine incarnation. Irene knelt down in front of her and told her they had a lot in common and were actually very similar. The girl learned information about Sonia that helped her understand her better as a person. She could never trust her parents, brothers, or sisters. Since childhood, Sonia worked for her family and for the temple, but they only used the little girl. And Sonia was always just a puppet in the hands of adults, as she had no one to trust. She had no other choice but to follow their example. Therefore, Irene didn't consider her a villain, but rather the girl was a victim whose feelings were exploited. She wanted to give her a chance. When a person lives for someone, they often forget their own needs. But having received this opportunity, the girl will be able to understand what she really wants. Irene said that she would no longer be used by other people, and that Sonia could finally think about her own feelings. In the end, it turned out that Irene, having become a divine avatar, began to feel more secure and stronger. And now it's time for Sonia to choose for herself what she really wants from her life. The tears she had been holding back all day began to flow down her cheeks like streams of rain on window glass. She tried to hold back, but the pain inside her was too strong. All the recent events, grievances, and disappointments had accumulated in her soul like an explosive mixture, ready to detonate. And Sonia felt her heart breaking into pieces as each tear brought relief. But at the same time, it reminded her how weak and helpless she had been in the face of life's trials. A silent moan escaped her chest, and she understood that at that moment, she just needed to let all the emotions out, to then be able to gather strength and move forward. On this beautiful and sunny summer day, fate once again brought Irene together with a man who truly helped her prove the whole truth. It was the Marquis. She asked him to spare her a couple of minutes for a chat. He said that fate itself showed him that Irene was a true divine incarnation, and congratulated the girl on her new status. The Marquis congratulated Tio and Irene, and behind him, words of thanks from the prince were heard. Irene stayed on the balcony late at night and feared that Tio would get angry again and become jealous of her towards the Marquis. The prince thanked the Marquis and told the girl that she had overcome all difficulties well. Irene said that, now that she had been declared an avatar, standing next to the master in front of so many people was truly amazing. Theo promised that the girl would soon get used to so much attention and said that she had become his true destiny. The prince whispered in her ear that she was the most beautiful girl in the world and that he didn't need another. Irene admitted that Theo was special to her since the first encounter and that she found him incredibly attractive. She looked tenderly into his eyes and thanked him for everything the night had done for her. Theo said that while they were separated, he felt as shattered as if all his vital force had disappeared in an instant. That's why he admitted that he wants to see the girl every day and dreams of her being with him for life. The next moment, Irene heard words that brought tears to her cheeks, and the prince asked her to become his wife. The girl began to cry loudly, and the young man started to worry that he had done something wrong. But in reality, her tears were of great joy because she thought she would have to give up Tio. But now she knew how much he loved her. Irene stood in her wedding dress. Her eyes shone with happiness and excitement, her hair adorned with a white veil that flowed gently down her back. And her smile was a bright and sincere incarnation of love and hope. The bride accepted congratulations with joy and beamed with happiness on this special day. The maid said it was already time to get ready to leave. Irene stood on the threshold of a new destiny, and as soon as she opened the doors, the celebration would begin. She walked towards the altar with one thought: she would find the happiness she sought, and she could give her love to the person who deserved it. When Tio saw the bride, his eyes filled with admiration and love. His heart beat faster, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. He stopped to carefully examine his beloved, and at that moment seemed to forget everything around him. The groom's gaze was filled with amazement at the bride's beauty, and he realized that soon they would be together for their whole lives. In front of an altar decorated as a backdrop, Irene and Tio exchanged rings. Symbolizing their eternal union, the rings shone in the candlelight, as if reflecting the love and the devotion that now united them forever. And with every word of the vow, pronounced with sincere awe, they touched each other's hearts, reminding each other of their mutual promises to love and respect until the end of time. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, full of love, respect, and mutual understanding. A wedding ring shone on Irene's finger, and now they were not just a couple, but husband and wife, ready to go through all the joys and difficulties of life together.
Juntos.